Release that witch eye by Ermo. Chapter 181 Soraya's Paintings. After Barav left, Roland went to the drawer and put the statistics into it. Looking back at Nightingale, he wanted to ask her what had happened with her, but after hesitating for a moment, he ultimately wasn't able to. He already had a vague answer within his heart, but saying something like that was too embarrassing, and even if he guessed wrong it might even be even more embarrassing. So in the end, Roland swallowed his question and said instead, "Now with this done, let's go to the North Slope mine. Do you want to go and see what changes Soraya's new ability could make?" Although Nightingale's behavior has become somewhat strange, her attitude was still the same as before. With a smile, she took off her hood and said, "Let's go." Perhaps I'm just thinking too much into this, Roland thought, as he looked at the witch who quickly came to his side. The ride on the hot air balloon on the other day had influenced far more than only one or two people. He never imagined that Soraya would become the second witch who gave birth to a fundamental change of her ability. In fact, even she wasn't aware of the change. Roland had only been present by chance when her talent appeared. Since the hot air balloon was a gift for Anna, it had been placed in the castle courtyard. Whenever someone wanted to see the landscape from high up, they had to call for Anna and lightning. But the day before, when it began to rain, Roland suddenly remembered that the out-of-rattan weaved basket would become soft when immersed in water, and even if it later got dried it would still lose its toughness. Thinking of this, he wanted to take it back into the castle. He had intended to let the servants do it, but he then had second thoughts about doing so. Whatever the outcome, the hot air balloon was his present to Anna, and the ropes and airbag were parts that could also be easily damaged, so he decided to personally bring it back to the castle. After he had called Hummingbird over and came to the vestibule, he got surprised by what he saw. The whole basket had a pattern painted on it. It was covered by a bird's-eye view of the scenery of Border Town. But unlike her previous photo-like paintings, her paintings unexpectedly looked like they would immediately stand up and come to life. And it also seems that the raindrops here couldn't fall on Roland either. When he took a closer look, he discovered that her paintings had for the first time gotten a thickness to it. It wasn't strange that a picture had thickness. Theoretically, every real picture should have had a thickness, because the pigment itself had a thickness. In paintings, this thickness could even be put to use. By using brushes, strokes, or scrapers it was possible to create rough textures, and through a variation of layers the realism itself could be increased, enhancing the expressive power of the painting. But Soraya's paintings were different. Her paintings weren't drawn with a brush and paint, but directly by using her magic. Therefore, that she was able to create this thickness by shaping her magic was especially surprising. He remembered that when he had softly touched those sticking out woods with his hands, it had really felt like he was scratching over branches and green leaves. It wasn't the case that they were hard and solid, but rather soft like gum. And when he touched the ground, the tactile sensation was very robust, as if he had actually touched a stone. Simply amazing. As well as that those raindrops flowing down along the drawn landscape were unable to soak the slightest bit into the rattan. Back in the castle, he immediately called for Soraya to come over, and then Nightingale also confirmed this point. When she observed Soraya from within her fog, the magic in Soraya's body also wasn't the same as before. Previously it was a golden whirlpool, but now it had condensed into a rotating ribbon. When they stepped into the military factoring compound, Anna approached and welcomed them laughingly, while giving Roland a big hug. Since they had deepened their relationship, the intimacy she showed him had become significantly more. Roland rubbed her head in a good mood, and the silver clip stuck to her hair flashed within the sunlight. But in the corner of the eye, initially Soraya had also intended to come over to greet him, but now she stood at her original place not knowing what to do. In the end, she began to blush and turned away, putting on an "I see nothing" appearance. Nightingale took Soraya's hand and pulled her to the table, and asked deliberately, "Did you draw this?" Roland smiled and shook his head, letting go of Anna, and went over with her. Only seeing that the whole table was covered with the demanded pictures, the paintings were exactly what you could see in the yard. The only difference between the paintings were the thickness. Some of them were only about a millimeter higher than the paper, while some came close to 3 centimeters. This was exactly the training concept Roland had arranged for her this morning. testing how far it was possible for her to thicken her magic paint. Is this the thickest one? Roland touched with his fingers a nearly 3 centimeters thick picture. The enchanted blue sky, that part of the picture was soft as if it has no texture in general, but when he slid his finger down to the yard's wall, he immediately felt a sound like friction. It seemed to be exactly as he had expected. After the evolution of her magic pen, the pictures drawn by her were not only in line with the shape and color of the original, even the tactile sensation came close to the original object. It can also become thicker, but increasing the thickness even more, the magical consumption becomes very large. Soraya pointed at a brown protrusion on the table. I wanted to draw the tree trunk outside of the wall, but I had barely drawn the basics of the tree trunk before I had already spent half of my magic power. This is your painting? Roland reached with his hand for a 10 centimeters thick painting. I thought it was really a bark. That being said, however, its connection to the table was exceptional firm. The prince used his hand to grab the tree bark and tried to pick it up until his 2 feet had left the ground, but even with this he was unable to separate the bark from the tree. Seeing this, Nightingale drew a knife, yet even after a long time she was still only able to cut a small hole at the bottom. This thing seems to have been embedded into the table. In the end, it could only be cut by Anna. She changed her black fire into a thin thread and swept it over the table. Afterward, the pigments began to emit white smoke and then it dropped off. The cut was smooth but not glossy. Instead it had several black scorched marks on it. Roland picked the fallen pigments up, and when he held it in his hand he discovered that it was far lighter than he had imagined. Why did you suddenly want to change your style? No, I mean, how do you decide to add thickness to your painting? Roland asked. I think it was probably because I had seen this kind of scenery for the first time. Soraya stated her memories. When I was high up in the air and looking down on the earth, I felt that the paintings I had made before, which you had said to be almost comparable to the real scene and had called a photo, was in fact not accurate. Especially when I used the basket to portray the scenery, and also when I had come down I thought even more in this way. She paused, then continued slowly, the tops of the trees are pointed, and the wind always blows through them carefreely. The mountains are high and low, resembling the ups and downs of a chest. And the river is embedded in the earth, the ships on top of it are pushing their way through. This was the scenery I had seen and not the extremely thin painting. So I had wanted that my picture would become more like reality. I wanted it to stand up, just like this magnificent scenery. But even after several tries I failed to succeed. During a moment of frustration, I suddenly remembered what you had said about those balls. Balls? Roland raised his eyebrows questionably. Well, she nodded shyly, that was at least what you had taught us. I thought that everything was made out of those small balls. Then shouldn't the pattern I drew also be the same? I made a few more attempts and imagined that the pattern illustrated by my magic pen were made out of colorful balls, all stacked to each other, and together formed a whole block of color. Then, the screen suddenly wriggled up, the green woods grew upwards, the dark blue river sunk, finally turning into the pattern you normally see. At that time, these changes shocked both Anna and me. If you hadn't mentioned it, I would never have realized that my magic had evolved. So, it was like this. But compared to Anna's black fire, with the exception that after the evolution my painting seems to be more vivid, it seems it doesn't have any other useful effect. Soraya spat out. No, why? Roland shook his head. In my eyes, they are not just simple paintings. It would be a waste if she only used this ability for painting. He remembered the scene where the rain had slid over the surface of the basket but was still unable to immerse into one of the scenes. Rather than a painting, it was a kind of coating magic. Chapter 182 Shaft Furnaces. As long as the object's surface was covered and formed a definite contiguous skin, it could be called a coating. The coating itself could be gaseous, liquid or solid, with all sorts of different applications to them. From the initial beautiful decoration, and later enforcing the durability of the object, all of these things could be considered as coatings. Afterward, Roland launched a series of tests at the substances. He became extremely pleased by the test results. Its concept could be roughly summarized with the phrase, the more energy her paintings consumed, and the longer she drew, the better they would become. Her previous pictures were already hard to completely erase, as long as their medium wasn't also destroyed, and now, after her ability had evolved, this characteristic would become even stronger in the future. Firstly, there was the high adhesive force and the light mass of these pigments. While on top they showed some of the physical characteristics of the object, it could also change its flexibility according to the depicted object. Things such as painted clouds or skies would be as soft as cotton candy, while still having a high resistance towards stretching and cutting. But when replaced with something made out of iron ingot, glass, or material of a similar nature, it then became hard and brittle, and could be directly smashed with a hammer. In other words, due to its limited mass, its performance regarding flexibility was far superior to its display of rigidity, which was consistent with Soraya's understanding of how the pigments worked. Secondly, regardless of which characteristics were shown, its chemical properties remained very stable. Not only didn't it react with dilute of sulfuric acid or dilute of nitric acid, but it also repelled water and oil. When Roland filled a coated paper box with water, the thin bottom of the box didn't show any marks of any water seepage. After pouring water into it, the clear liquid beads rolled in the box like dew on a lotus leaf. And when he touched the bottom with his finger, he confirmed that even then it still remained dry. For the high-temperature resistance test, Anna went to the paper box and dropped some molten iron into it. The paper as supporter caught fire immediately. The coating itself, however, except for stretching a bit, didn't change much. Only when Anna used her black flame to directly burn the coating did it begin to deform and melt, emitting a white smoke until it finally turned into a mass of black jelly. The fact that the coating also had an insulating effect totally excited Roland. After all, coated copper wires could be used the same way as enameled wire, which he had already proven by building a simple DC motor in the yard. At this point, Roland had completely understood the capacity of Soraya's new ability. Unlike Anna's black flame, which entirely different from her previous green fire, Soraya's new ability was more like an evolution of her previous painting skill. She could now draw a realistic oil painting, or she can also just draw her photo like the pictures from before. Her abilities could also be used in parallel, it only depended on what she had in mind to make. Also, when she drew a picture and if the thickness of the coating was kept under 1 centimeter, Soraya could draw several hours without needing to stop. But when she drew with a thickness of at least 3 centimeters, her magic consumption would also rapidly increase, and at a depth of 10 centimeters, she hit a threshold, almost immediately exhausting her magic with only 1 or 2 strokes. Of course, from another perspective, this was also the most efficient way in which to counter the demonic bite. Also, after the evolution, her magic still belonged to the category of summoning, and as long as it came within the suppressive range of a god's stone of retaliation, her magical pen would also suddenly disappear, making it impossible for Soraya to draw a new pattern. However, the already drawn coating wasn't affected by a god's stone of retaliation. Under Nightingale's observation, they had discovered that when Soraya's paintings were drawn, they no longer contained any trace of magic to them. In other words, the material created by her magic pen became a real existence. As for how to use the coating, there were too many possibilities. Soraya herself had never imagined how much of a change her new ability would bring to the town. For Roland, her new ability meant that he could quickly get some coated water pipes which were totally rust-proof, and large bundles of enameled wire. Even bricks would become usable at high temperature. He suddenly saw the light, for his original seemingly 3 out-of-reach engineering projects: tap water system, electricity, and access to roads. At the same time, this also reminded him of the point made that personal experience was far more profound than reading axioms from books. If he could get the witches to see the world in its subatomic state, and get them to accept the particle theory, would it lead to a new round of evolutions? Such as, letting them even observe microorganism under a microscope. Roland felt that it was necessary to try it, at least try it. Asterisk. North Slope, the furnace area. Blow. Let the fire burn even hotter. Lysia shouted. Although it was impossible to directly see the scene inside of the shaft furnace, with the 3 carts full of charcoal, the stones should already have turned red from the heat by now. When he was invited to the town by a letter from Van Bate, he thought that the town was only a desolate and barren land, and if it hadn't been written that he could start a new life here as a mason, he would never have run to the kingdom's border to resume his old trade. By temporarily leaving his family behind and taking only his own luggage, he had already prepared himself for a life lived inside of tents while only have porridge to eat. Having nobody in charge and also not getting any payment were problems often encountered within the construction business. Lizia hadn't intended to stay for a very long time inside border town. As long as he could see Carl, his longtime friend, and see how he was faring with his life here in exile, he would be satisfied. But reality was always different than you expected. When he had reached border town by boat, he saw Carl was already waiting for him at the dock. Previously, Van Bate had been a distinguished mason in King City and was even a powerful contender for becoming the next leader of the guild. When he compared him with his former appearance, Lizia saw that his temples had turned white and his face had a few more wrinkles to it, but his body wasn't thin. Instead, he was very sturdy, his face even burned full of spirit. After they had exchanged their greeting, Carl didn't take him to a noisy and messy site, but unexpectedly led him to an apparently new residential building, where he handed him his keys with the words, "This house is yours. Put your luggage away first and then we can go to the pub and have a drink." And then in the pub, out of Carl's mouth Lizia heard a series of incredible stories. Carl, with his status as a civilian, was recruited by Lord into working at the city hall, not only becoming an official with a fixed monthly salary, but also the construction sector executive. If you stay, you will also receive the possibility of entering the city hall, provided with free housing. After 10 years of work, you also get a retirement allowance. Are you asking yourself what the benefit of a retirement allowance is? It means that you will get money without even having to work. Lizia had thought that Carl was just drunk and speaking nonsense, so the results afterwards weren't as he had expected. Carl was speaking the truth. Open the slag discharge port, clear the slag. After the work was done, none of the problems envisioned by Lizia had appeared. On top of that, not only did they immediately get their money from the Lord, but the Lord also reacted exceptionally fast. Whenever they had a request, they would always get their answer on the following day. Plus, this was also the place they produced an alchemical product called cement. With it, he could easily bond bricks, allowing the construction process to advance by leaps and bounds. Here he could experience a kind of unprecedented carefree feeling, like never before. Just within a month, Lizia had already built 5 blast furnaces, and 3 additional shaft furnaces for iron smelting. The shaft furnace was the result of his hard thinking during the years after the disbandment of the Mason Guild. It was the product made using all of his gathered experience. He had already thought that he could only pass it on as a blueprint. Never would he have dared to believe that he would one day see it erected before his very eyes. The modified shaft furnace was nearly 2 meters high and had an internal diameter of about 75 centimeters. The lower parts of the furnace's body was provided with a number of air nozzles, which could be used for drawing in air by using bellows and ventilation, leaving the bottom for the slag discharging port and the leaving port for the molten iron. Next to the shaft furnace they had erected a ramp made out of sand and gravel, making it convenient for them to feed, and also to observe the situation within the furnace. Today was the first day where the shaft furnace would be put into use. According to the usual practice, before it was officially opened, it had to undergo a smelting test. During the trial they had intermittently opened the slag discharging port more than 10 times, and had also added new charcoal 2 times, coming to the conclusion that the furnace had passed its inspection. The molten iron was now flowing into its sink. The slag mouth opened smoothly, and the temperature had met the high temperature needed for smelting iron, so there was no need to continue wasting charcoal. After all, to reduce loss, during the furnace test they had used the waste or they had collected in the corner of the yard. After opening the iron discharging port and letting the molten flow out, Lizia announced the furnace shut down. 2 days later, when the furnace chamber was cleaned up by townsfolk, they also excavated several pieces of dark stone. Under the high-temperature baking, the other wastes had been discharged several times. Only these pieces of ore were left. After they were thrown in they almost hadn't changed at all, only their surface had become more bright, just like black ink. Lizia could also not determine what this black ore was, he only knew that it was a waste product of the mining process. Yet its shape and appearance were really pleasing to the eye, not resembling anything useless. But if it was useful and they were unable to melt it, how should they create artifacts from it? Unable to come to a conclusion of his own, he straightforward picked out a block of the most preserved ore, covered it with a cloth and sent a man to the castle to give it to Roland Wimbledon, the lord of Border Town. Perhaps the well-taught lord will know the answer. Chapter 183 The Township Construction Plan. What is this? Nightingale asked while looking at the black, shiny stone on the table. Obsidian. Roland didn't even raise his head a bit, entirely busy concentrating on drawing the blueprint. What kind of stone? No, I was just speaking nonsense. He sighed, slightly looking upwards at the shape and color of the stone. Only the ghosts will know what this is. After all, he wasn't a geological engineer. Even if he had a pure metal right in front of him, it still wasn't guaranteed that he could distinguish it, even less by what the ore looked like. The knowledge he had in his head only told him that most of the ores were a complex composition of compounds. Different impurities gave them different colors. For example, iron ore could be composed out of hematite, pyrite, and siderite, which when looking only at by using their outer appearance, seemed to be thousands of miles apart. Especially pyrite, which would sometimes show a light yellow metallic luster, leading to the situation where it is often identified as gold, giving it the nickname, fool's gold. As for their heat resistant, the compounds themselves didn't have a fixed melting point. This was related to its impurities and its ingredients, so by using temperature alone, it still wasn't possible to distinguish between all the different varieties. Furthermore, even if the metal elements existed in their ion state, as long as he didn't know its purification method, the smelting would be useless. There actually exists something you do not know about? Nightingale asked in astonishment. There are a lot of such things. Roland put down his quill and made himself a cup of black tea. Do you want to drink something? No, she waved her hand to decline. That's right, beef jerky isn't as delicious as salted fish. It would be better if you put some salted fish into the drawer later. For a moment Roland was silent, then he decided it would be for the best if he pretended not to have heard her. Regarding the stone, he intended to give it to Kyle Sichi and let him deal with it. After all, minerals were radioactive to some extent, so placing them in his office just so they could serve as decoration wasn't a very good choice. Recently, after Soraya's ability had evolved, he had suddenly discovered that there were a lot of new things he could now create. The first of which would be a tap water system, which would greatly enhance the standard of living for the residents. Just thinking about what it would be like if he was one of the residents, who came home covered in sweat after a busy day, but when they wanted to clean their sticky bodies and they happened to discover that the water tank was empty, which meant they would have to go to the next well to fetch some water, this kind of feeling had to be bad. Moreover, Roland was very tired of the process of always having to get a jar of water when he wanted to wash his face or wash his hands. In addition, he always got the feeling that there would be some parasites growing within the water after a few days spent inside the tank, not to mention that water tank was rarely ever cleaned even once each month. And when he took a closer look over the sediment at the bottom of the water tank, he could also see some caterpillars-like creatures flowing. In case they used a water tower for their water supply, there would be no additional technical difficulties. They could just use a steam engine to pump the water from Redwater River directly into the water tower, and from there they could rely on the siphon principle to let the water flow through the pipelines and into each house. With this they would have formed an infrastructure for an automatic water supply system. The reason why Roland hadn't put it into practice until now was because of the missing materials. If they used water supply pipes made out of iron or copper, which didn't have any anti-rust treatment, the pipes would be turned into scrap iron within a few years. Brass pipes were perfect for water supply pipes. They were corrosion resistant, and their internal walls wouldn't also become encrusted. They were non-toxic, and with their copper ions, they would also be sterile. But from which area should he take the money to produce these pipes? The output of the North Slope mine was far from being sufficient to be used for luxury products. Even within later generations, high-grade copper water pipes were still considered as products only used within high-end residential areas. At present, border town was not only unable to export ore. They were even reliant on external sources to satisfy their demand. So, whether it were iron pipes or copper pipes, Roland was very reluctant to use them for something which didn't give much benefit but was purely for his own enjoyment from getting a water supply system. But now it was different. With Soraya's coding magic, he could make the piping out of thin air. With her magic, they could easily manufacture water pipes, for example by taking an iron pipe as a mold, wrapping it in paper and then have Soraya cover it in her coating. Afterward, they only had to take out the mold and they would get their pipe. Even if these kind of water pipes didn't turn out to be pressure resistant, it would be sufficient as long as the water pipes were placed in a covered ditch. Second, would be the creation of a power supply system. He was afraid that there was no way to spread it over the whole town within a short time, but to let the castle shine in full light had always been something that Roland had wanted to achieve. Having to read books using the weak lighting of a candle wasn't only too painful for the eyes, it also caused them great harm. Furthermore, the summer was coming up soon with its hot temperatures even during the nights. If they then also had to put on candles and torches, what kind of atmosphere would it then be? Nowadays, with generators and wires, the road wasn't too far before the castle could enter the electrical age ahead of its time. As for the filaments for the lamps, Roland vaguely remembered that the usage of tungsten wire carbonized bamboo filaments were commonly used to produce incandescent. And bamboo wasn't a rarity. In the forest south of the Redwater River there were a lot to be found. However, what border town currently needed most were smelting facilities. The quantity of their iron production was directly related to the scale of their mechanical production and weapons manufacturing, which were both needed for the survival of the town. "Are you painting a tower?" Nightingale sat at the table and asked curiously. "Almost," Roland nodded, "but it is inside is empty and it can be filled with fuel and ore. It has the same function as a shaft furnace and can be used to smelt iron or into pig iron." This was an upgraded version of the ancient blast furnace, a vertical shaft furnace. To learn about Lysia's plan for a shaft furnace, Roland had visited the construction site and had taken a look. To tell the truth, with the exception that its capacity was too small, and the temperature it could reach was too low, its structure had been very close to a blast furnace, and if Soraya hadn't evolved her magic, giving the town the possibility to produce fire bricks, Roland had intended to build a dozen of such shaft furnaces. But now, where they had refractory brick, they naturally should consider a furnace which could reach a higher temperature, and had a higher output than the blast furnace. The height of the new shaft furnace was nearly 8 meters, enough to have as much as 4 times the capacity than the old shaft furnace. The furnace was tower-shaped, and its largest part was 3 meters wide. In order to prevent the tower from collapsing, he had installed some brackets at the bottom. The furnace walls were relatively thin, with a thickness of half a meter, and the innermost layer would be made out of Soraya's heat-resistant fire bricks. At the same time, it also had a ventilation hole through which a steam engine would continually provide fresh air. In order to make full use of the power of the steam engine, Roland had also designed a set of automatic feeding equipment for the blast furnace, which included a climbing rail and a movable door at the bottom of a unique material cart. With the help of a steam engine, the cart would climb to the top of the furnace. There the buckle at the bottom of the car would insert itself into a hook, pulling open the pouring mouth and dumping the fuel or ore into the furnace. For this era, this system could be regarded as the best possible method. Unlike the old shaft furnaces with their large openings and low heat, his new furnace, once it started production, wouldn't stop for a long time. Though they would have to continuously feed it with fuel and ore, its output would be much higher than that of Lysia's shaft furnace. As long as they construction 5 or 6 of these furnaces, the town's pig iron production would be multiplied. When Roland finished drawing all the blueprints, he rubbed his sore wrists and then took a box out of one of the table's drawers and pushed it in front of Nightingale. The startled Nightingale didn't know what to expect. "This is... I had intended to give it to you at an early time, but engraving the pattern took some time. After all, I'm also not extremely skilled with the machines in the factory." Roland smiled. "You should open it and take a look." On his words, she stretched out her hand to open the box, and was unable to suppress a gasp of surprise. Looking inside, she saw 2 revolvers which were completely different from the prototypes used by Carter. The 2 pistols were made out of shiny silver and polished so much that she could see her own reflection within. Furthermore, its body and grip were engraved with delicate patterns. On top of the barrels he had even engraved Nightingale's name, dedicated to Veronica. This idea had already been in Roland's mind for a long time. Compared to carrying around those inconvenience flintlocks from before, the newly developed revolver was quite perfect for her. Whether it was their security or their firing rate, it was all of a high level. And now, after giving such powerful weapons to the hands of an agility type like Nightingale, Roland was already looking forward to the results. "Thank you." With a big smile on her face, she picked up the 2 pistols, jumped off the table, and directly stepped into the shooting position. "Will you teach me how to use them?" Of course, Roland nodded, seeing Nightingale in her white assassin outfit coupled with a gorgeous and dazzling smile, made him instantly understand what it meant to be handsome to the point of having no friends. Using them isn't difficult, as long as you are able to sneak at the target's side, you only have to pull the trigger. Training with them this afternoon should already be sufficient. Chapter 184 Self. Scroll stood in front of the door, outside of the bedroom, unsure of whether she should enter. However, she decided to push the door open and step into the room. Within the room, she saw Wendy sitting at the table looking miserable while holding a book in her hands. Scroll didn't even need to take a look, she could already guess that it was certainly the basic theory of natural science. Scroll couldn't stop herself from chuckling out loud. She had rarely seen Wendy ever display such an expression. Even when they were trapped in the impassable mountain range with the Witch Cooperation Association and the shortage of goods had already reached a critical level, she had still always shown a smile, trying to cheer up every sister, seemingly never worrying about the hardships they had to endure. "I had never expected it would be a book that would trouble her so much. I'm unable to understand it at all, is what you think, right?" Scroll said. "It was the same for me when I read the book for the first time." "I thought you were Nightingale," Wendy, who had heard her, chuckled and turned her head. "And now? It's still impossible for me to understand it." "Fortunately, you and I are alike." Wendy sighed. "Anna would never say that. And I would never have expected that it would be Soraya who would be the second to connect everything and evolve her ability. I feel that if I'm not working hard enough, I will soon be surpassed by the younger generation. I do not understand how His Royal Highness knows so much and that what he says about the invisible world is actually the truth. In fact, there are numerous things he isn't aware of." Scroll shrugged. "I'm referring to certain aspects." "Such as?" "It's the matter with Nightingale," Scroll said, taking a stool for herself and then sitting next to Wendy. "Don't you also find that her current behavior is very different from how she acted in the past? Previously she had always concealed her body when she was protecting His Highness. Even if she merely went out she would still put on her hood, but she is now even listening earnestly during the evening lectures. You, who are living with her in the same room, should be even more aware of this than I am. Maybe you can tell me what had happened to her in the end?" "Nothing," Wendy shook her head. She had just finally made her choice. Seeing Wendy's disregarding attitude surprised Scroll. "Her choice?" "Well, it is just as you have guessed." Wendy closed the book and bluntly said. Without a doubt she had developed feelings towards His Highness Roland Wimbledon, which can clearly be seen without having to guess. If they shelter one of us, it is only a matter of time before they win the heart of the witch. During the journey with the Witch Cooperation Association, it wasn't uncommon to hear rumors about things like this. Those were just stories made up by others. Most of the sisters did not fare well in those circumstances. His Highness is not the same as the people in the stories." Scroll got startled. She did not expect to hear this coming from Wendy, who had held the same view as herself until recently. "You know, us witches are unable to have children, the prince cannot. The prince will take a witch for his wife." Wendy didn't even let her finish speaking. "He even told you so personally." "How can it be that she knows about it? Was Nightingale present at that time?" Then she suddenly understood what the other wanted to say her. "Wendy, do you blame me for not telling this to you? I just didn't want to let this matter leak out." This could bring unnecessary problems on His Highness' road to the throne. Wendy remained silent for a while and then said, I know, and I'm not blaming you because it is exactly the same thing I previously said to Nightingale. Before I knew His Highness' answer, I thought it would end well if it were to happen to one of our sisters, but since the prince does not mind it, do we really have to try to change their minds? Previously, when Nightingale suppressed her feelings, she always seemed to be depressed. I prefer how she looks now. No matter what the outcome will be, at least she followed the feeling of her heart. So that's the reason, Scroll thought. Although she agreed to not abandon the practice of not letting the news spread, she still doesn't want to stop the development of the feelings of her sisters. Unexpectedly, there is a difference between Kara, who never allowed someone to do something on their own, wanting to be the only one who decided how to deal with their problems, where Wendy instead is always looking at it from the perspective of her sisters, even trying to cheer them up during their times of hardship. But is His Highness aware of this point? Scroll suddenly thought of a serious problem. What if his decision is based on not knowing about the witch's inability to give birth? Oh, Wendy's voice also turned depressed. How about, you go and ask him? Asterisk. West of the town, outside the city walls. Closer to summer now, the sun shone brightly on the grassland. In the near distance, flocks of cattle and sheep leisurely eating grass could be seen. It was hard to imagine that only 3 months ago, the whole landscape had been covered in snow and that there had been nothing outside except for terrorizing demonic beasts. The shooting training had already lasted for most of the afternoon. Nightingale was able to master the shooting skill even faster than Roland had expected, much faster. Everyone's talent is probably just differently, he thought. Some people are just born to fight. By now, her loading, aiming, and firing positions has become completely unlike that of a novice. If she had been born in a knighthood, she would be one of the top stars of the knights in the Kingdom of Grey Castle. Carter couldn't help but praise her, just like me. Luckily she wasn't. I do not want her arms to be as thick as yours. Roland glanced at him. How was the feeling, being able to achieve a draw with an extraordinary witch? When I got hit, I thought that I had been hit by siege hammer. My whole chest got shattered, Carter said honestly. To tell the truth, it felt terrible. Luckily there should not be a next time, Roland laughed. Waiting until another round of still-standing shooting was finished, the prince applauded Nightingale and called her over. So far you performed splendidly. Because of that, let now do a simulation training. After putting her pistols into the belt, Nightingale walked towards the prince and a sweat droplet on the tip of her nose sparkled in the bright sunshine. Do you see those targets? Roland pointed to the 5 targets not far away, standing at bust height. They are hanging above some god's punishment stones, so you should be able to see their position very clearly from within your fog. Within the test you should combine your skills and your guns, knocking down those enemies, all while exposing yourself only for the shortest time possible. Within the fog, the objects and space were changing constantly, making it difficult to ensure that the bullets would fly towards their target. Previously, when she had tried shooting directly from inside the fog, the results were that out of 10 rounds of bullets, 9 changed their line of flight after leaving the fog. They changed their trajectory so much that Roland, who was standing behind Nightingale, was nearly hit. Therefore, whenever she shot, Nightingale had to step out of the fog, and the shorter amount of time she exposed herself, the more difficult it would become for the enemy to counterattack. Understood, she smiled, raised her cloak with one hand, and disappeared into thin air before the two of them. When the first shot of the revolver could be heard, Roland only saw a white figure quietly emerge, and then with an eruption of a flame and gas the target got hit and broke apart. Even before the broken wooden parts had completely landed, Nightingale had already arrived behind the second target, pulling the trigger from a distance of 3 to 4 meters from it. And then the third, the fourth. For every shot, she had never completely stepped out of the fog. In addition to her silver pistol and a spark of fire, Roland couldn't make out any other details. It was already difficult just to catch her position with his eyes. When Nightingale moved forward within her fog, it was just like those scenes he had seen in movies in the past. Within the blink of an eye, all 5 targets had been destroyed, and after another blink, Nightingale once more stood at his side. How was it? Nightingale laughingly asked. Roland looked at the stunned Carter and asked, "What do you think?" "I'm afraid no one can catch Miss Nightingale." Chief Knight took a deep breath. "Even if they put on a godstone of retaliation, they still wouldn't be safe." "So, did I graduate?" She wiped the sweat from her nose and rubbed it onto Roland's body. "Of course." Chapter 185 The Star of the Theatre, Part 1. The Swan followed the Redwater River on its course westwards. May was standing on its bow, her eyes looking straight ahead. She wasn't standing here to enjoy the scenery, she just wanted to finally be able to see Border Town's pier. "How much longer will it take us to reach our destination?" she asked impatiently. "We will be there soon, Miss May. The sun is shining on you again. It might still be better if you went back to the cabin to rest," Ghent, who was standing directly behind her, said. She didn't have to look back to know that at this moment he would have a pleasant smile across his entire face. And as she then turned around, she discovered that she had been right. "That is exactly what you've told me before. How can it still be soon?" "In the end, have you really ever been to Border Town before?" For a long time he only mumbled something unknown, then he scratched his head and embarrassingly said, "The last time I was there was already 10 years ago." 1 year is already long enough to change the Lord of Longsong's stronghold, so what do you think could have happened in a decade? May asked, annoyed, "But there are always exceptions. I only have to look at you, no matter if it was 10 years ago or yesterday, from the beginning to the end you've never stood on stage even once." Seeing that she had finally swept the smile from her counterpart's face, she was finally able to find some comfort in her heart. If it hadn't been for Irene's massage, she really would never have ever wanted to go with this group of fellow performers to perform at Border Town. As the female star of the theater in Longsong Stronghold, she was quite famous throughout the Western Territory. She had even received an invitation from the owner of the Tower Theatre to come to King City and perform in Prince Seeking for Love. The show had been a great success, and even the master of drama, Mr. Caden Fazzo, admired how she had played her role in The Prince Seeking for Love. Although she hadn't played the heroine, she had still left an impression that wasn't any less impressive than that of the female lead. But when she had excitedly come back to the Longsong Stronghold, she had discovered that the stronghold had undergone enormous changes. Duke Ryan had been defeated, and the territory had fallen into the hands of the fourth prince, Roland Wimbledon, who had handed over the task of governance to Petrov Hill of the Honeysuckle family. She had left the West for less than a year, but within that short period of time it had become entirely unfamiliar to her. Fortunately, the turmoil in the political upper ranks only had a small effect over the theater. If only this had been all, but when May had spoken with her sisters about the war during a meal, she had received the news that the first knight of the Western Territory, Morning Light, had also been captured. Hearing this, her heart immediately squeezed together. Afterward, May directly rushed to the theater, looking for Irene to ask her about the situation, only to discover that Irene had followed him 2 weeks ago and went to Border Town, probably to reunite with her husband. Hearing this news, May felt a little depressed, but at the same time, there was also a little envy mixed in with it. They both worked in the same theater, and she really deserved to play the leading figure, while Irene was the yet-to-rise newcomers, the flower of tomorrow, but the title only came from that group of inferiors actors who were flattering each other all the time. In regards to her appearance, May was confident that she would never lose to anyone. On the side of family background, although she was only from civilian origin, Irene, however, was only an orphan adopted by the theater, so when comparing themselves, she had a lot stronger standing than Irene did. However, this hardly gave May any relief. Ferlin Eltak, the Morning Light, still developed feelings for Irene with her naive-looking face. Later he even married her, even giving up his family inheritance for this. "Look, there is farmland in front of us," someone shouted. "We can't be too far from Border Town now." May looked to the left side of the ship. There she saw rows of knee-high wheat swaying in the wind, and farmers wearing straw hats were busying themselves in the fields as if they were standing within a green sea. The clear river water reflected wheat fields extended westwards, with no end in sight. "Such a beautiful scenery, Miss May." Rosia walked over, nodding her head in greeting. "In such a remote place, I never expected that I would see such a vast farmland not inferior to the farmland around Longsong Stronghold." That's nothing compared with the farmland around King City, May disagreed. There, the wheat fields are so large that they even connect between two cities. Along the roads the only thing you can see are wheat fields, so the people soon become bored of it. Is that so? She smiled awkwardly. I've never been that far away. Well, this is the response ordinary people should show, May thought. In case it was Irene who had heard these words, I am afraid she will just show an expression of envy and ask myself to tell her more. Rest assured, you will have the opportunity to get there one day. I hope so. Rosia patted her chest. Thank you for your encouragement. I mean, you only have to spend some silver royals. With that you can take the caravan to King City. I never meant that you would ever have the chance to go to King City to perform. May rolled her eyes within her mind. But the other was still only one of Irene's friends, so May didn't want to bother herself to speak those words. Rosia had joined the theater before herself, and her age also followed closely with her own, but because of her plain appearance and poor memory, she had never gotten the opportunity to officially perform on stage. In addition to Irene, there were only a few people who were willing to deal with her. Irene knows that we are coming today? May asked. In my reply to her I informed her of the date, so I'm sure that she will be meeting us at the docks. Then it should be all right, she nodded. I do not want to be alone in a strange town, and have to look for lodging in an inn. Can I ask you something, Miss May? Rosia asked hesitantly, why was it important for you to leave together with us for the town? Moreover, why did you also want to conceal this from the theater? Irene said that this was a small opportunity for those who won't be started elsewhere, but you are not someone who lacks such opportunities. In case I had told them the truth, do you think the theater would ever let me come to this place? May curled her lips in disdain. As to why I want to come here. I merely want to see if my theater comrade is having a good life. After all, I do not know why I have made this impulse decision myself. The Longsong Stronghold's theater is performing a drama in the next 2 days. And now that I'm gone, I am afraid that the theater owner really have a headache. Although there are several backups who can play my part, without my name, the aristocracy may not be willing to accept it. They might even send a grave protest to the theater. Honestly, this wasn't a wise choice. May also knew this. Her own reputation relied heavily on the theater in Longsong Stronghold. And if she annoyed the theater owner, he could simply turn it into a cold environment for her and start promoting another actress. If it came to that, she would have no way of ever fighting back. It was important that she uncompromising acknowledged her mistake. Otherwise, she would have no choice than to leave right away and go to another theater and try to compete with their stars. Or, I could also take the next ship back to the stronghold, the moment after I have met up with Ferlin, right? May thought. So that's how it was. Rosia nodded in understanding. Irene will certainly be very surprised to see you. The scenery along the river bank gradually became richer. The closer they came to the impassable mountain ridge, the more tents and wooden houses that appeared. It was close to noon at this time, and the peasant women were all busy cooking porridge stew, covering the residential area with its smell, letting May also occasionally smell the floating over aromatic fragrance of wheat. Children had come together to the river to play, and those who were able to swim shed of their clothes and surrounded by the cheers of their companions jumped headlong into the river, only to triumphantly climb back ashore afterward. Then May finally saw the pier. After the Swan had landed, Gant and Sam volunteered to handle all of the ladies' baggage. And after a pedestrian had just left the ship, Rosia excitedly shouted, Irene. May following the direction of her shout, on the pier she detected a woman wearing a white dress and weaving in their direction. And directly by her side stood a tall man. Even across the great distance, she could still make out his straight and vigorous body that was out of the ordinary. Ferlin Eltek, the morning light. The figure in May's memory became clear once more. Chapter 186 The Star of the Theater, Part 2. The moment May spotted him, she immediately put away all thoughts of returning to the stronghold. My God, May. When May came over, Irene exclaimed in disbelief. Irene grabbed her hands and pulled her towards the knight. Darling, do you know who she is? She is the most famous actress of the Longsong Theater, Miss May. Whenever she performs, the people who want to see her play line up from the theater's lobby and into the streets. Although the phrase darling caused May's heart jump, her perennial acting habits allowed her to reflexively smile and give a little nod. Hello. Ah, of course I know about her. You've even told me about her being one of the most famous actress in the West. There aren't any nobles who do not know the name for the star of theater, he sighed, then spoke in an apologetic tone to May. My wife is a little lacking in her some manners. I'm Ferlin, welcome. He didn't announce his name or his status, and even concealed his family name. May's heart was filled with sadness, but on the surface she maintained her utmost elegant expression. I'm familiar with you. Everyone in the West knows of the first night of the Western Territory, Morning Light, Sir Eltec. I must apologize, because of the stress of theater work, I was unable to attend your and Irene's wedding. That's a thing of the past, the knight said with a smile as he shook his head. Nowadays, I'm just a teacher, and I no longer belong to the Eltec family, so you really don't have to be so polite to me. He then waved in the direction of the others and continued. Let's go back. We can talk later, but first you have to finish your application for temporary residence. Teacher? May was startled. Does that mean he's now a court tutor? The town's lord is indeed a prince, but the prince would never lower himself to find a knight to take on such a role, huh? And what's all this about applying for temporary residence? Shouldn't Irene be taking the group of us to a local reliable and safe inn to stay at? I really did not expect you to come here. If you were to play Cinderella, it would certainly cause a sensation. Is that so? May had some doubt about that. She had never heard the name of that drama, which indicated that it had probably been written by a new playwright. Moreover, it wasn't like she had spare time for rehearsal. She'd only come here because she wanted to see how Morning Light was doing, and if there was some way she could help him. After entering town, May realized that there was definitely something wrong in this place. The town was located on the border of the kingdom and the only role it served was to be an outpost for the stronghold, so why did it now look like a newly built city? The road everyone was walking on was covered with dark gray gravel, and there was no mud to be seen anywhere on the whole road. Furthermore, the streets were too wide, practically allowing two carriages to pass each other side to side. What kind of road is this? Sam asked the question that was in her mind aloud. It looks strangely flat. Hee, Irene smirked. When I first arrived here it was still made of mud, but now it's become like this. Furthermore, the road still isn't finished yet. The masons have said that this is only the foundation for the actual road. Then they've fooled you, Rosia retorted. Everyone knows, only houses need a foundation. Things that are already lying on the ground can't collapse, so why should they need one? Really, they mix a kind of fine, grayish powder together with stones and then they spread it out. Afterward, they sprinkle water on it and compress it with a stone roller until the road has become flat and smooth. In the beginning, I also thought this was the new sort of road, but the mason said that this was a practice developed by His Highness. It seems to be called water whatever layer. In short, this is still only the foundation. Irene turned around and continued leading the way, allowing her long plate to swing with each step. In the future when more people and carriages start using it, the ground will be paved with slate. Only then will the true road be finished. Paved roads? May coldly laughed inside her heart. Other than the inner city of King City, which other city in this kingdom could cover its roads with slate? Having such a broad and flat road was already good enough. There were still many mud roads in Longsong Stronghold. Along the way through the town, she saw how many houses on both sides of the road were being demolished, regardless of whether it was a clay tile roofed house or a wooden house. Although they were clearly not new houses, they still a far cry from being called uninhabitable. Did the Lord drive them away because they were blocking the road? No, they've all moved to another district. District? May asked. It is the new residential area, where everyone gets exactly the same brick house to stay in, Irene explained. All the original residents had been assigned one, that means there will be no leaking or broken houses in town. Everyone can be allocated to a brick house? May could not believe her ears, this was even more exaggerated than paved streets. Does she have any idea how much such an idea will cost? But since she was in front of Ferlin, she still had to swallow her words. There were a lot of other pedestrians on the street, so they would occasionally be stopped by people who wanted to greet Irene or Ferlin. Thanks to this, May found out that Irene was also one of those so-called teachers. "Aren't you going to perform in the play?" she asked. "Why do the townspeople call you a teacher, Irene?" "Because that is my job. I will only be performing part-time. After all, Border Town can't have a theater." Afterwards, Irene told the story of how had been summoned by His Highness. Although it will be an open-air performance and the audience will only consist of civilians, the pay will be still calculated according to that of the stronghold. "I think this is a good chance. At least, in this way I can still practice." You are right. As long as I can go on stage I would be satisfied." Gant and Sam nodded again and again. "An open-air performance for civilians?" May simply didn't have the strength to retort. Compared with Irene, she could not understand why the prince came up with this idea or what his intentions were in the end. Could those people whose purpose every day was only to have enough to eat and stay alive really comprehend the romance and its twists and turns of a drama? In this manner, they finally came to a stop in front of a 2-story building. "This is the teachers' building. Right now Border Town only has 9 teachers. Therefore there are still many vacant rooms left. Ferlin had already applied for you to stay inside the house and he'd also got the rights for you to temporarily stay in 2 rooms. So you will be living here during the show." Irene handed out 2 keys. "Ghent, Sam, this one is for you. Rosia and Tina will get the other one, Miss Mays." "I'll stay with you," May suddenly blurted. "But I came here to see how the lives of my theater companions were," she said with a smile. "After all, we have already been working together for such a long time, and you probably also will never return to the stronghold, so I want to talk some more with you." "Are you going to hold this against me?" "Of course not." Irene happily took hold of her hands. "I'm just worried that the room is too small for you to live in. There are also a lot of things I also want to ask you." Then she turned around to face the other 4. "Let's first put away the luggage, then you can come over to my room and we can sit and read the script together." May climbed up to the 2nd floor and followed Irene and Ferlin into their new home. Stepping in, her last hope was shattered. Although she didn't want to admit it, this small room gave off a comfortable and clean feeling. The tablecloths and curtains were obviously new, recently purchased and made of a red and white thin cotton. The floor had been swept spotless. They had a linen carpet in the living room. In it some strange cups had been placed on a low table, which attracted May at her first glance. Stepping forward, she picked them up to take a closer look, but even after a moment she was still unable to identify its material or why it was so light. It was a bit like wood, but the surface of it was smooth and full of brilliant color. It was nothing like those cheap goods affordable by civilians. Depicted on top of the cup were also 2 people who were affectionately holding each other. "It is a charming cup, right?" Irene said as she leaned over. "They are too expensive." They were sold for 5 silver royals at the convenience market and the 4 of them made a set, containing all different postures of people. "To celebrate our first payday, Ferlin insisted on buying them for me, which in the end resulted in us spending our whole salary." "That fool." "Convenience market?" May deliberately ignored the other part. "Right," Irene said, nodding. "The Lord has opened a market at the town square, where they are selling some very fine daily necessities, but their prices aren't low either. If you want, I can take you there tomorrow and you can have a look." May had mixed feelings in her heart. The situation was completely different than she had expected it to be. She thought that, as a defeated captive, and a knight for whom no one had been willing to pay ransom, even if the Lord had released him, his life would still have been very difficult. And since Irene didn't perform regularly, she wouldn't have had any savings. Therefore, besides accompanying him during his hardship, she wouldn't be able to help him in any other way. At that time, Ferlin Eltac would have seen any assistance she gave as sending charcoal during snowy weather. Maybe even one step further, by relying on her influence, she could try to persuade the local lord to allow her redeem the first night. That way, she would have been able to completely reverse the knight's heart. But she found that all her ideas had come to nothing. and not only didn't he not need her help, furthermore he was also leading a good life in Border Town. Should she go back? But, if she now chose to leave, Ferlin and Border Town would from now on be forgotten forever. May fell into a swirl of confusion. Chapter 187 New Business Organization. As the summer came around, Margaret's River fleet arrived at Border Town. Roland had intentionally received the female merchant at the pier so that he could incidentally examine the goods she had brought with her. The most valuable goods were the 3 boats full of saltpeter. By now, Border Town's gunpowder reserves had basically been exhausted. Even the first army firing exercises had come to a stop. Although they had already started to equip the army with revolver rifles, they still had to stay in practice with reloading, gun maintenance, and replenishment of their ammunition. Now, with this batch of saltpeter, they could finally resume firing training. In addition to saltpeter and in accordance with their agreement, she had also brought 2 ships with ore ingots. These were mainly iron and copper, as well as a portion of green vitriol ore. Just the unloading of these goods already needed 2 or 3 days' time. When Roland offered Margaret the opportunity to inspect the 2 steam engines, he had placed them in an eye-catching position in the yard. Furthermore, he followed his usual practice of covering them in red satin and wrapping them in a fancy pattern. In fact, during nearly the whole month, the West Industrial Company was only able to put 1 steam engine together while producing hundreds of scrap parts. Because of that, Roland had Anna process the defective parts that didn't deviate too much from the desired product and had her fuse them together into a second steam engine to catch up with the delivery schedule. To Roland's surprise, Margaret had not come alone this time. She had also brought a group of merchants from King City with her. When the delivery of the goods was organized, Margaret and her partner followed Roland back to the castle where they enjoyed a sumptuous lunch in the reception hall. "Your Highness, this is Hogg, an old friend of mine. He owns one of the largest mining business in King City." Margaret pointed at them one after another. "This is Gamier and Marlin. They belong to the Crescent Moonbay Caravan." They were very interested in learning more about these steam engines, and since I have known them for many years, I was too embarrassed to sell it to them myself, so I brought them with me so that I could introduce them to you. "I offer my regards to your honored highness," said Hogg, puffing out his large belly while his face glistened with grease. "Margaret told me that this machine can be used in the place of manpower, and that it can quickly pump water and transport ore out of a mine. Moreover, it doesn't have to take a break and can run throughout the whole day. Would it be possible that I see it with my own eyes?" Of course, Roland sipped a mouthful of wine. At first, he had been completely unable to adapt to its sour taste, but he had gradually gotten used to it. "But if you want to make it carry ore, you also have to install the railroad system. After lunch, I can take you to the North Slope mine, where you can see it for yourself." "Your Royal Highness, I am also very curious about all the different uses of the steam engine that you've described. Can it really be installed on a sailboat and move it forward without sails?" Marlin began to ask. "In case it is possible, would it be possible for it to resemble a 3- or 4-masted seagoing ship?" "I'm afraid that it wouldn't be strong enough. In that regard, steam engines are just like horses. Some of them have a lot of force while others have less. It depends on the type of model it is. Of course, machines with a greater output are naturally more expensive. And when one isn't strong enough, you can also install more, like maybe 2 or 4 of them." Roland answered with a smile. To use a steamer on board, even if it's the most primitive paddler, it would also need a complex power transmission and handling system. In addition to Border Town, there isn't any other place in the Kingdom of Grey Castle that has the technology needed to modify a ship. But the installation cost would certainly be much higher than that of the steam engine itself. In that case, the Crescent Moonbay Caravan also wants to order those machines from you. Gamier forked a steam bun that had just left the steam basket and stuffed it into his mouth, but its fresh juices were so hot that he narrowed his eyes. Sure enough, similar people always group together. The friend of rich people will always also be rich. Even without seeing the actual product, they finalized an order right away, as if thousands of gold royals were nothing in their eyes. Roland shook his head. "Unfortunately, at the moment, Border Town lacks manpower. With the issue that the steam engine is very complicated to create, I am afraid it will be difficult to produce any additional machines before Margaret's order is completed. I can provide you with the needed manpower, Your Honored Highness, Gamir said, patting his chest. Both carpenters and blacksmiths, even shipbuilders if needed. I have a lot of them stationed at my dock, and they would all come free of charge. And then you'd have them learn the manufacturing method so that you can produce it yourself? Hogg interrupted. 10 years, Your Highness, Gamir opened his palms. I am willing to let them work for you for 10 years, and there will be only one requirement, that is that the first steam engine made by them will be offered to the Crescent Moonbay caravan. That is an attractive offer, Roland thought. It would be the same sort of technology partnerships later, where our side would only provide the technology and still make a significant profit, while they wouldn't only get the steam engine as soon as possible, but also get a number of skilled workers after a decade. In this way, the workers' salaries would be equivalent to the cost of purchasing the technology. I don't think we have to be so urgent to finalize a deal. We can take our time discussing the details after I have shown you the machine. Roland pushed his hands onto the table. Furthermore, the steam engine isn't the only product we have here that is worth buying. There are some other things you might also be interested in, for example, this. He snapped his fingers, and on his command, a group of guards took some objects out of a wooden box and placed them on the table. These are the newest creations of Border Town. No matter which of them you choose, they are all of the best quality but still at a reasonable price. For example, this simple mug, Roland pointed at a colorful cup on the table and said, it is light, pleasing to the eye, and yet not as fragile as a crystal cup. The pattern above can also be customized. Furthermore, it won't get wet, so it is very easy to clean. It won't get wet. Margaret picked up a cup and took a carefully look at it. You can try it with some wine, the prince joked. And after you've drunk from it, you can pretend to be drunk and throw it on the ground to break it apart. It works. Gee, this really is very excellent. But, I'm afraid you won't be able to guarantee that every cup will have such a quality, right? The big-bellied hog had already poured himself a cup full of wine and threw it back at this time. Hey, it's really still dry. Of course, it was still dry. It was essentially just an ordinary wooden cup merely coated with one of Soraya's paintings. The pattern on top of it was of her own design. It does not conflict with the usage of crystal cup. Those are for more of a formal court banquet, while my cups are more suited for the personal chambers of the daughters of wealthy houses. Roland said, as far as I know, they like bright colors, and can't resist things with such a beautiful appearance. I believe it is as you've said, Margaret said while nodding in interest. You seem to have a lot of experience in this field. Kiki, the prince coughed twice, and now, please fix your eyes on this one. The thickness of the breastplate is entirely uniform, and the back and front are made out of wrought iron. I don't think I even have to mention that it is lighter than a knight's plate armor, and it is possible to put it on without assistance. After it is closed, there doesn't exist even the smallest crack. It is perfectly suitable for the guards escorting caravans. But the most crucial point is that it is cheaper than plate armor. After the presentation of all the goods, the merchants began whispering to one another. To allow them some privacy, Roland offered them some time for discussion and left the hall, going over to the flower garden at a side corridor to get some fresh air. Your Royal Highness, I was only away for a month, and you already have a lot of new things here. Margaret had stood to come follow him. Don't you want to exchange your opinions with them? No, the moment I set my eyes on something it's unnecessary for me to try and listen to other people's thoughts. When there is good merchandise to be had, whether other people see its worth or not, it's all the same to me. She smiled and shook her head. Our caravan will be staying here for 3 to 4 days, so could you. Let me see lightning again? Although she does not recognize you, at least she didn't express any sentiment of dislike towards you, so I think that there won't be a problem. Thank you, Margaret said gratefully. If you're going to stay for so long, you might as well come see a play. 3 days from now, Border Town will hold its first theatrical performance. You were able to build a theater in 1 month? Margaret exclaimed, shocked at the idea. Of course not, it will be an open-air performance right in the middle of town square. I think it will be different than what you are used to. I will do so right away. Deference is no substitute for obedience, Your Highness. Margaret placed her hand on her chest and performed a low bow. Chapter 188. On with the show. 2 days later, after the visit to the North Slope mine, Roland agreed to a new trade contract with Hogger and the Crescent Moon Bay caravan. Hogger's eyeballs had nearly fallen out after he saw the smoothly operating railway transport mining system. He even put forth an application to build a factory in Border Town, which would specialize in the construction of rail lines and their supplementary equipment, while the profits he obtained would be split in half, but Roland refused his investment offer as it would need even more of his people. After all, right now Border Town wasn't lacking in money, but people. Hogger, after all, was just a mining businessman. Although he possessed several mines, and managed an open-air silver mine for Count Canberra at Silver City, the men below him were only miners, which was on an entirely different scale compared with the strength of an entire island like Crescent Moon Bay. In the end, he put his name under a contract ordering 10 steam engines and a full set for the mine transportation system, including their track and tub, set to be delivered in 6 months from the date. The first half were to be delivered before the months of demons, and the second half around the start of the coming year. The contract with the Crescent Moon Bay caravan was of a much larger scale than his previous deals, including even a 10-year contract with them. Next time the caravan arrived, it would bring a team of 300 people with it, mainly composed of blacksmiths and carpenters. These people's salaries would be paid for by the Crescent Moon Bay, while Roland only had to provide for their food and accommodation. The steam engines produced by them would be sold with the highest priority given to Crescent Moon Bay, and then after the 10 years, the worker could decide for themselves if they wanted to stay or go back. This was a point that Roland had brought up several times during the negotiation. Without a doubt, the people sent with the next caravan would be some of their most trustworthy supporters. Even for the people shipped in later with the caravans, they were bound to try choosing people with the highest degree of loyalty to the Crescent Moon Bay. So when it then came for them to making their decision, it was unknown if even half of them would decide to stay. However, Roland could never have enough skilled workers, so even if only one of them decided to stay behind, he would still have made a profit. Something he always worried about was that, even though he had the technical advantage, he might not have enough people to bring the technology to reality. Apart from the steam engine, the second largest order was for the transformation of their vessels. Along with the 300 craftsmen, the Crescent Moon caravan would bring 2 inland sailing ships in the hope that Border Town would convert them into ships that could be driven by steam engine. Each ship's conversion would come with a fee of 1,800 gold royals, which meant that the 2 ships would come up to directly exceed Margaret's steam engine order. In contrast, despite that all 3 sides ordering the mugs, the total amount of the order was still less than 300 gold royals, even though Roland had already increased the price of the mugs to what it was in his convenience store by 10 times. This let him feel the gap in the profit between civilian merchandise and industrial products. If you were unable to mass produce, it would be better to only satisfy the requirements of Border Town's inhabitants. What surprised the prince a little was that his iron breastplates and the iron farming tools were completely disregarded. But later, during dinner, Margaret offered him the answer to his doubts. Although your breastplates are indeed cheaper, however its yield is too small, if we want to resell it, we have to include the transportation cost together with the tax. So, in the end we would only make a profit of 5 to 6 gold royals. Moreover, your armor is either forged with a hydraulic hammer or by using the steam engine. In either case, with that method, the price of the armor will stay fixed, and the majority of the expense will come from the quality of the material, rather than the quality of its production. After a short pause she continued, and buying them for our own usage is even more unnecessary. On the sea, whether it be the sailors or the guards, they rarely wear heavy armor, which would only make them sink more quickly in the case they were to fall into the water. Most of the time, they see armor as fetters and handcuffs, not as protection. It's the same with your farming tools. If you cannot obtain an enormous amount of cheaply priced iron, they will be cheaper but not by much when compared to similar local goods, which makes it difficult to make a profit off them. While the situation with those colorful cups is completely differently, their price isn't at a fixed number. It can't be said for sure that the nobility will fond of them, but it is still possible to earn several times our initial investment. After thinking about it for a while, Roland had to admit that this was indeed the case. The price for the armor and farm tools was stable, and since the material costs accounted for the bulk of the price, it was still difficult to force the price down by forging them with his more efficient steam engine instead of the hydraulic hammer, so, in the end, the difference was too small to attract the interest of a big merchant. In addition, these plate armors, which had Soraya's anti-stabbing coating on it, was actually a part of the First Army's armament upgrade, so until the iron production didn't go up, it would be impossible to sell in large amounts. Soon, it was time for the anticipated theater premiere. On this afternoon, even though Roland had demolished the surrounding buildings, which doubled the size of the former central square, the town square was still so tightly packed that not even a drop would be able to trickle through. To promote the play, Roland had already started informing people about it a week ahead of time. Moreover, he had specially requested the Ministry of Agriculture to send people to the outskirts of the town and mobilize the serfs to come watch the drama. Roland, as the town's lord, naturally had the best viewpoint. In the direction of the stage, directly facing the show, Karl had erected a temporary wooden platform. It was made up of 3 rows of wooden benches, which could accommodate about 100 people, and the place in the middle of the 3rd row was reserved for Roland. On one side were places for the members of the Witch Union, with Anna sitting next to him, while on the other side the merchant group had taken their place, with Margaret sitting as his direct neighbor. The first and second rows were mostly filled with City Hall officials and their apprentices. In order to ensure their safety, the people surrounding the wooden platform were made up of members from the First Army, who could watch the drama while at the same time separated the location of the prince from the civilian population. Now, at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the sun's burning heat had already faded, and together with a fresh breeze from time to time which was produced by Wendy, everyone on the platform could enjoy a VIP-level treatment. Under the applause of the crowd, the actors stepped onto the stage one by one. To tell the truth, Roland was completely unsure of what kind of result the premiere would achieve in the end. After giving the script to Irene, he no longer intervened in the drama. The recruiting and rehearsal have been fully done by her and Ferlin. Now, in retrospect, how much experience could a theater newcomer, who had only appeared on stage once, have gathered? And the friends recruited by her were those people who had never gotten the chance to perform on stage in Longsong Stronghold. Only here in a small town could they become actors. In other words, this was a newly created team of new actors who planned to perform a new drama. Fortunately, Roland didn't mind if it became a failure. After all, this drama wasn't meant to sell tickets and also not there to promote a good script. The only goal of the show was to remold the people's ideology and free them of their prejudices. For this to happen, it had to be performed more than once. So even if this time they didn't play out well, they would undoubtedly have improved by the time of the next performance. "Now, I finally understand why you were so confident in this show," Margaret suddenly exclaimed. "You invited Miss May." Roland got startled. "Who? Do not tell me you do not know about it yourself, my God. Before I came here, I've also seen her show in King City." Margaret smacked her lips. "No matter if it is taking hold of her character or the build-up of emotions, she is the best. I do not know how many people she has already moved to tears with her performance in Prince Seeking for Love. Even Caden Fazo was full of praise for her." "Who is Caden Fazo?" Roland went through his memories, but he couldn't find any impression of him within his head. "Your Royal Highness, are you really a person from King City?" Margaret blinked with her eyes. "Please give me the liberty to ask, who is the most famous person in King City, apart from the people of the court?" "Yorko, the Devil's Hand," Roland blurted out, but directly afterward he knew it was the wrong answer. "Oh," the businesswoman gave him a meaningful glance. "The most famous playboy. I heard that with one hand alone he could get a woman to never forget him." "I understand. Relies only on one hand?" Anna leaned over. "What for?" "No, nothing." Roland slammed himself on the forehead. "We had better earnestly follow along with the drama." Chapter 189 Stars and Flowers. The play didn't have a theater curtain, nor an introduction. Their preparation area was separated from the stage by a board. Their stage was simple and crude, and for most of the cast it would be the first formal performance of their lives. This story takes place in the capital of a kingdom. Within the outer city, there lived a beautiful and kind-hearted girl. Accompanied by the sound of the narration, Irene slowly walked onto the stage. Her whole attire was a filthy gray gown, the hair on top of her head was a hideous mess, and her face was covered with dust. Swinging the broom in her hand, she was carefully cleaning the ground, from time to time even bending down to wipe the difficult-to-remove dirt using the end of her gown. After several days of rehearsal, Irene had thoroughly memorized the whole story's process in her heart. The story was quite simple. A civilian girl had lost her mother, and was now constantly being bullied at her home, but because of the girl's kindness she was then rescued by a witch, who used her magic power to give the girl the opportunity to participate in the prince's party, where the prince and she fell in love the first moment they saw each other. But since the witch's magic was only effective for a limited time, she was forced to leave the ball in a hurry, and in her panic she left behind a crystal shoe. In order to find the beautiful girl, the prince had the whole city be searched. Ultimately, he found her in the outer city, and from then on the two of them lived happily ever after. The story was simple and easy to understand, yet its plot completely broke away from the former description of a princess and a prince's love, by allowing a common girl, who due to her kind nature gained the assistance of a witch, be able to win the prince's favor. As the Cinderella of this performance, the part where the character gathered up her courage to resist the oppression she had to face her whole life, would be the actress' greatest highlight of the performance. So Irene had never imagined that May would give the leading position to her. Irene was already euphoric enough that the star of the Western Territory was willing to share the stage with her. Moreover, as the pillar of the Stronghold's theater, May had enough pride and confidence to play the leading role in all kinds of theater stages. Yet in Cinderella she took the initiative to play the supportive character of the half-sister. This was somewhat hard to believe for Irene, until the other side repeatedly emphasized that this was a performance of new kind of character, and that Irene had the talent needed to play Cinderella. In the next rehearsal, she gathered all of her strength, not only to repeatedly practice every scene, but also when lying in her bed, even after the candles had gone out. She would still be going through the acting skills taught to her by May. So as not to fail to live up to the other side's good intentions. Fortunately, Irene was not without experience, so being on stage while having the eyes of countless people on her, she relaxed her body, and let the repeatedly practiced actions reappear one by one. Until now, she felt that she was in good shape and hadn't made any errors. She even encouraged Rosia, playing the witch, with her eyes when the other had forgotten her lines. I split the wheat porridge in half, but do not eat too quickly, it is still very hot. Thank you for your kindness, young woman, I will surely repay you. When Rosia bent her back and crookedly walked backstage, one after another the masses began to applaud, making Irene feel relieved. After all, she knew that, when someone forgot their words during a formal performance at the Stronghold's theater it would count as an utterly intolerable error. The nobility would immediately begin to boo and ridicule the actor, rather than trying to encourage the artist with applause. At this point, it was May's debut. This part of the story was about the conflict of the mean older sister and Cinderella. Under the bullying and humiliation of the older sister, Cinderella could only hide in the basement and begin to tearing up as she held the portrait of her birth mother in her arms. But now, as May stood before her, Irene suddenly felt that the atmosphere had completely changed. She was no longer the quiet and taciturn theater star she had been during the rehearsals. Instead, she had turned into the ruler of the stage. With her lofty manners, her just perfectly executed body movements and unhidden contempt in her eyes, she placed Irene under a strong feeling of oppression. Oh, take a look at that, who is this? Under what kind of delusion are you to think you don't have to work in broad daylight? You poor wretch shall return without delay and wash my dress. And you'd better be not clumsy, this is a formal banquet dress. You cannot afford to damage it by even a little. After her words, May ferociously pushed her back, and according to the plot Irene was supposed to pretend to fall, but under the cold look in May's eyes she couldn't stop herself from taking a few steps back, accidentally tripping over her own feet and falling to the ground without any buffer. Her elbow hit the stage floor and sent a burst of pain through her body. Truly just a useless waste, May's eyes were no longer set on her. Instead, she went to the center of the stage, facing the silent crowd on the square and began her monologue. "That's worthy of Miss May," Margaret whispered amazed. Just with a few simple words from her she was able to attract the attention of everyone. Her character has already become alive. "Oh, indeed impressive," Roland nodded, "but this person was also way too ferocious and overdid it." The loathe and disdain she showed toward Irene seems as if it was her real feelings. Even sitting back here, I could feel her ruthlessness. How infectious her emotional appeal was could be seen in the expression of the entire audience. However, she was not the protagonist. Irene's relatively good performance had been suddenly completely overshadowed. If this goes on, I'm afraid the leading role will be overtaken by a supporting character. Irene was stunned. She knew she had to stand up quickly. May's monologue, which was primarily about her longing for the prince, as well as the court ball, wouldn't last long. So before the end of the scene, she had to leave the stage. But her familiar feeling from the previous rehearsals had already left her, turning the stage into a complete and utter stranger to her. "Are you only on this level?" Only when May finished her act and while passing by weaved her skirt so that its edge slapped against Irene's face, was she able to recover. Even though the other didn't say a word, but by looking into the cold eyes of the star from the west, Irene could understand her meaning. May had wanted to say that Irene should pull herself together. Since their two characters' personalities were like fire and water, once May reached out her hand, the play would be ruined. She clenched her lips, spreading an iron taste through her mouth. When she saw May disappeared behind the board, she also wanted to get up and leave. However, Gant and Sam carrying props had already stepped on the stage. When Sam placed a bucket in front of her, he took the chance to say in a small voice, "The next scene is still yours, just stay here while we work. Come on, you can do it." Irene knew that this wasn't according to the script. To be truth, she had already missed the opportunity to leave. Thus the audience saw an unusual change of scenery. Cinderella sat motionless on the stage, while her surrounding scene has been modified from the living room into the basement, changing the beautiful round table and wooden chairs into barrels and rattan baskets. While people who handled the props went back and forth, the girl maintained her position, as if she was frozen in time. In the next act, Cinderella was trapped in the basement, and the witch came back to rescue her. Not only giving her beautiful clothes, but also summoning a carriage, which sent her directly to the castle. Remember, the spell will only last until midnight, so you must leave the palace before the last bell rings, or the clothes and the carriage will disappear. Yes. I've got it. Thank you. At this moment Irene was still unable to shake off her daze. Hiding in the background she secretly watched May's play. She only thought that the other actor seemed to be completely free. In front of more than 1,000 viewers she still had a blossoming smile. What a powerful woman she was. Standing on the stage and having to face the bright star, only then did she thoroughly realize how amazing her counterpart's acting was. Is this the distance between stars and flowers? When Rosia finished her dry lines, it was time for the first drama, the court ball. In order to achieve the effect of a grand ball, the scene needed the whole cast to go on stage. In addition to her, and May, Ghent, Sam, Rosia, and Tina were dressed as other noble dancers that were wearing masks. And dressed as the prince, was her lover, Ferlin. Chapter 190 Victory and Defeat. The actor playing the prince is quite handsome, yet his facial expressions are very stiff. Unexpectedly he is, Roland was somewhat surprised. Morning light, the first night in the Western Territories. At present, he holds the position as a teacher in Border Town. He can't be regarded as an actor. He isn't an actor? The businesswoman asked, flabbergasted. Then how can he go on stage? Because of limited staff, he laughed. Just take a look, there is no one besides those two who handled the previous change of setting. If the prince were to be played by one of them, it would truly be unlikely for Cinderella to fall in love at first sight with either of them, based on their appearances. You are right. While changing into her beautiful dress, Irene stood on the side and had to watch as May walked towards Ferlin's side. Irene saw how May placed her hand on his shoulder and began to dance. no, Ferlin wasn't dancing, he was merely being guided by May's exquisite dancing skills and following along with each of her steps. This dance wasn't part of the rehearsal. Irene was aware that this was May's improvisation. Her older sister tried to seduce the prince in every way possible, yet the prince remained unmoved, merely keeping his manners and talking, until Cinderella appeared in front of him. His eyes wandered over and took in the sight of the charming and delicate woman, who had bright eyes and white teeth. Irene knew that as soon as she walked past him, according to the script, Ferlin was meant to throw May aside, thereby staging his and her tale of love at first sight. However, anyone who was able to see would likely ask, for what reason should the prince dump the beautiful and touching woman at his side, for the presently so muddle-headed Irene who completely lacked any allure? At this moment, she saw Ferlin turn his gaze towards her at last. In his gaze she saw helplessness, comfort, encouragement, and she also saw his love. Irene suddenly felt the stage become quiet. The people's laughter, their voices, and the sound of their arguments was gone. Her theater companions were also gone. Only May, Ferlin, and herself was left on the stage. Sure. My acting skills are a far cry from the Star of the West, so does that mean I should just give up and admit defeat? No, said a soft voice at the bottom of her heart. No, she wanted to act. To her, this was a rare opportunity, or, more than likely, her last chance. If she were to give up now, she would probably never have the opportunity to stand on the same stage with such an outstanding actress ever again. She also wanted to become like May, able to lead the audience's emotions with her behavior, gathering everyone's attention on her alone. I'm sorry, May, she said in her heart. If the prince was played by just some random theater actor, it would already be difficult enough for her to gather the courage to compete. By relying on her acting skills alone, it would almost be impossible for her to beat the Star of the West. But he isn't just anyone. He is morning light. He is my lover, Irene thought. Please, forgive me for being so shameless. It's just that I never want to lose in front of him. The stage completely disappeared. Instead, a cornfield appeared in front of Irene's eyes. The heavy ears of wheat were already ripe and hanging heavily, gently swinging in the evening breeze, just waiting to be plucked. In the distance, the sun slowly disappeared behind the horizon, coating the slowly flowing Redwater River in many warm colors. This was the place where they had frequently met up for their tryst. In this red-orange sunset, the prince changed back into the night, turning back into the man with whom she had fallen in love with so many years ago. As long as it was in front of him, she could always let her most beautiful side bloom, making it impossible for him to move his view away from her. No longer acting, but instead showing off her true self, Irene lifted her robe, tied a knot in it and walked towards Ferlin. Now when her heart was full of confidence, everything seemed so natural. The moment she reached the knight's side, she smiled to May, and the latter unconsciously loosened the hand resting on his shoulders. May I have this dance? She asked. Ferlin's natural smiling expression reappeared within his eyes. Of course you can, my lady. Although she wasn't as skilled as May, under her guidance, the knight moved more naturally than his former jumping. The two people's tacit understanding in the scene infected the audience, which began to applauding and whistling, followed with their cheers. All the clamor brought Irene back to the stage. Stepping on her toes, she gently placed a kiss on the prince's cheek, before she pushed him away, turned around, and quickly ran off stage. At the same time, the deep and resounding sound of the bells rolled over the square and came back as a faint echo from the far-off mountains. Not much longer, and it would be the midnight. Soon, the drama came to its end, but with it also came the end of the play. On his search, the prince went from house to house in the city and he finally came to Cinderella's home, but this time the young lady wore a dirty and grey robe and was holding a broom in her hands while being pushed to the side by her older sister. The sister was still beautiful and she could also put on the crystal shoe. Your Highness, why are you still hesitating? I am the person you are looking for. No, she is not. Why you shut up? Even though right now, May's performance was no less perfect than before, and was even more oppressing, but Irene no longer cringed away from her. Instead, she came out of her corner, slowly arriving at the central stage. There, she looked straight into the eyes of her counterpart with an unyielding look, full of resistance. Everyone watching this beautiful scene began to clap. At this moment, the witch suddenly appeared. She reached out with her hands and put the ball's dress on Cinderella once more. "Your Royal Highness, she is the person you are looking for." Rosia forcefully tore off the grey robe on Irene, exposing her beautiful dress. Almost at the same time, she stroked through Cinderella's wild hairstyle, smoothing it out, and with this, the Cinderella who had snatched away the prince's heart appeared in front of everyone once again. The atmosphere of the audience immediately began to overflow. When the prince embraced Cinderella, everyone stood up, and a timely gun salute could be heard from outside the grounds, pushing the people's mood to the peak. The endless applause and cheering continued until the narration came to its conclusion and the actors bowed and left. Only then did the audience stop. "This was incredible," Margaret clapped enthusiastically. "I thought that the young woman would be overwhelmed by May. I never expected the result that she would be able to come back. Furthermore, I do not know whether or not it was an illusion, but her interaction with the prince felt even more natural than May's. It was as if she was meant to be together with the prince." "It was indeed surprising," Roland nodded. Irene had changed her entire personality at the end, which must have been her inherited acting skills which arisen, as a result giving her the capacity to maintain her self-confidence even under May's overwhelming personality. In a short time, the prince had changed back into her husband, breaking away from the stocks and chains. This kind of ability was also very outstanding. In the future, in all likelihood, she will become a rising star. Furthermore, the ringing bells and salute created by Echo were equally perfect. Due to not having arranged any practice sessions, Roland had given her freedom at the beginning of the play, but he'd never expecting such a pleasant surprise. "I lost," May closed her eyes. She had spent a lot of effort in making sure that Ferlin Eltek would play the role of the prince so that he could see her at the task she was the best at, being on stage, and in this way she could leave a deep impression on him. Ultimately defeating Irene with her acting, she could use this way to show him the gap there was between Irene and herself. For this, she had nearly stayed a week in the town, even going through rehearsal with people she would at normal times not even look at apart from a quick glance. After being delayed for so long, she was afraid that if she now went back to Longsong Stronghold, the theater boss wouldn't treat her as well as he had before. And the most ridiculous part was that she hadn't even been able to completely defeat Irene on stage. Even though she hadn't lost to her acting skills, she had lost to the other's love. That being the case, it was time to let go. May took a deep breath, changed her clothes, and left via the rear face. When she reached the end of the ladder, she was suddenly greeted by a man. He was also tall, he stood straight, was handsome, and dressed in shiny silver armor, and was probably one of Border Town's knights, but unlike Morning Light, who always wore a warm smile, he appeared to be arrogant and cold with his raised eyebrow, long and narrow eyes, and thin lips. "What's the matter?" May asked with a frown. "Hello, Miss May." The moment the other side opened his mouth, the cold air dispersed without a trace. "I'm His Highness Chief Knight, Carter Landis. Your performance was so fascinating. May I ask if you would like a drink?" Chapter 191 The New King's Bared Teeth. Petrov sipped the black tea, leaned against the soft lord chair, and let go of a long sigh of relief. 2 months had passed since the takeover of Longsong Stronghold, and by now he discovered that he liked the hall more and more. Its step-by-step ascending structure allowed him to overlook the lower-standing officials and attendants from the lord's seat. Having such power in his grip let him have a feeling of satisfaction. During the first month, some small aristocrats stepped out and openly questioned him or secretly planned riots and such things. Of course, the people who provoked them from behind the scene came from Elk, Wolf, and several other big families. Following his father's advice, Petrov delivered the commoners who created trouble or belonged to the underground rats directly to the gallows, while the small nobles were imprisoned and after their family paid the ransom were expelled from the Western Territory. When this method was put into practice and thunder-like struck down on them, the situation soon subsided. After all, with the exception of the Honeysuckle family, the knights of several other families had been arrested and brought to border town, making it impossible for them to build up any resistance against Petrov's policies. Afterward, he again guided the interest by announcing that the stronghold shall compensate the big families for their loss during the seizure, in this way forming a stable group of nobles who all shared a common interest. With the exception of the 30% which had been transferred to border town, the remaining 70% of the stronghold's income were split into three sections. 30% were used to keep the city operating, 20% were used to appease the other noble families, and the remaining 20% were invested into the Hull's territory. Nowadays, the old portrait of Duke Ryan that had hung behind the Lord's seat was exchanged with a picture of the fourth prince, Roland Wimbledon, but he already looked forward to the day when it was exchanged with one of himself, a portrait of Petrov Hull. In case he thoroughly took possession of Longsong stronghold, they could turn the tax used to operate the city and the one invested into their own territory into one, becoming truly worthy of the name of a dukedom. And the 50% which were used to appease the other nobles could also be saved. Instead, it could then be invested in the stronghold's trade, in exchange generating an even higher income for themselves. Of course, the premise for all of this was that Roland Wimbledon could conquer the throne and rule as king of the kingdom of Grey Castle. My lord, one of his guards entered the lord's hall and handed him a letter. It contains news from border town. When Petrov heard that the letter had come from border town, he immediately straightened the way he sat. He received the envelope and took a fragile piece of papyrus from it. From the poor quality of the letter, he could immediately recognize that it was from one of his eyes within the ranks of the serfs. The outcome of the battle 2 months ago could be said to be an outrageous result. Although Petrov hadn't personally taken part in it, he still had heard a fantastic story from his father. In order to find out the reasons for the Duke's failure, he had dispatched some of his confidants to border town. They would pretend to be artisans, herdsmen or serfs, and send all the information they had gathered back to the stronghold. He firmly believed that the others' families had done the same. But so far, each month he had only gotten information from the 2 people disguised as serfs. Those who had pretended to be craftsmen or herders hadn't given any sound of their presence, as if they had vanished. In the end, had they betrayed him out of their own will, or were they discovered by the prince who totally removed them? He shook his head, instead focusing his attention on the letter. The content of the letter was written with charcoal and also crookedly written. In some places it even had some traces of water, indicating that it had been written sneakingly while working. The first paragraph was about how they were building a tower with an unknown purpose at the shore of the Redwater River. At present, they had already erected 3 of these bases which had a height close to that of the stronghold city walls, and on top of each of those bases, they had placed an enormous metal pot. It seemed that the blacksmiths had constructed the metal pot in town, afterward transporting it to the river as a whole piece. Then the first army would surround the iron tower and standing with their back to the iron pot, and on the next day, the tower was magically erected. Building, it's again this word, Petrov thought. It was also mentioned in the previous secret letter. Just looking at that information, it seems that the prince is always building something. Last time he had repaired the roads and constructed that bridge, this time he is building that iron tower. Could it be that His Highness is spending all of those gold royals he had plundered from Longsong stronghold in one go? Furthermore, the function of those towers is still unknown, even though my scouts who are disguised as serfs are not real serfs, but in actuality are knowledgeable knights, so in case that those towers were watchtowers, they would able to see it by the first glance. Probably those towers are still not entirely built yet, making it difficult to judge their purpose. Petrov shook his head. I should wait until next month, maybe I will get more detailed information then. He shifted his gaze to the next paragraph. There he read that for a week a large-scale merchant fleet of an unknown owner had stayed in the town's dock and afterward left eastwards. During their stay, a lot of ore and saltpeter were also unloaded from the ships. The purchase of saltpeter is easy to understand. After all, the second month of the summer will usually become very hot, and because of this, the castle will consume a significant amount of saltpeter for cooling. Furthermore, it can also be used for cold drinks and fruit juice. As a royal aristocrat, the prince certainly doesn't want to sweat all day, like the peasants on the fields are. But the purchase of ingots totally surprised Petrov. After all, Border Town was a source for all on its own. I can still remember, prior to the months of demons, when I was sent as a messenger to Border Town, Prince Roland had exaggeratedly said that they would be able to double the amount of ore they could sell. But now, the result was that not only didn't they export ore, but now they are also importing ingots? This, together with those city wall-high like iron towers, meant that Petrov himself was now more and more unable to understand what His Royal Highness wanted to accomplish. But when Petrov read the last paragraph of the secret letter, the contents immediately left Petrov stunned. In the last 2 weeks, Border Town had held several open-air theater performances at the town square. They didn't sell tickets, and the drama's name was also unheard of. Moreover, they were even encouraging the serfs to go watch. But the most surprisingly part was that one of the performers was the recently vanished star of the West, Miss May. What kind of situation is this? That Miss May had gone missing was the biggest news of recent times. Several of the dramas in which she should have played the leading role were now played by others, and because of this the nobles had all left halfway through to express their protest. And when they demanded an answer, the theater claimed that Miss May had left without any explanation, and that her whereabouts were currently unknown. When the news had become public, it had caused an uproar among the drama-loving nobles of the Western Territory. In the end, she went to Border Town? They don't have there any theaters. Furthermore, to be playing in front of civilians and serfs. Petrov's had some difficulty imagining such a picture in his mind, since the impression he had gotten from Miss May was that she wasn't an amiable or an approachable actor. After carefully thinking about it, he decided to write a letter to His Royal Highness Roland Wimbledon, officially inquiring about this matter. As a theater enthusiast himself, in the past months he had been unable to see the fantastic performance of the Star of the West, not to mention getting the chance to personally invite her. Since the drama was a public performance at the town square, it wouldn't be too surprising for it to be seen by a peddler who might have come from Longsong Stronghold, and this could be given as the reason for the news to have reached his ear. Doing it this way, he won't expose his knights who are disguised as serfs. As soon as Petrov was ready to have one of his attendants draft the text, a knight rushed into the hall, and hurriedly said, "My lord, we have a message from the guards at the east gate. A team of knights are nearing the stronghold." Knights? Were they able to tell who must have sent them? He suddenly stood. "The other side is holding up a flag with a tower and 2 pikes on it, sir," the knight replied. "In case they aren't pretenders, they must be from the new king's forces." Chapter 192. Under the curtain of the night. About 50 people had come. They were all dressed in armor which was sparkling in the sun. Standing in lines of 8 with flags on all sides, 3 of them displayed the insignia of the royal family, the grey tower with the 2 pikes additionally. On one side there was a flag with a tower and a horse's head on top. Carving through the memories at the back of his mind, he remembered that this was likely the symbol of the Haas family of the northern border. One of the cavalrymen stepped out of the ranks and yelled, "I am Lehman Haas, the messenger of King Timothy. With me, I have brought the resolution of the king. Pull down the drawbridge." "Your certificate?" Petrov stretched his head forward and asked loudly. Hearing his question, the cavalryman took a bow and arrow from his back, tied a piece of paper to the arrow and shot it directly to on top of the city wall. One of his guards immediately went over and picked up the arrow for Petrov. When he unfolded the parchment, he saw some faint crisscrossing golden threads embedded at the bottom of the document, and there at the lower right corner was the seal of the royal family, which indicated that he was indeed the new king's messenger. Seeing this, Petrov took a deep breath and shouted, "Lower the bridge and open the gate." He could already roughly guess the content of the so-called resolution. It was undoubtedly related to Roland Wimbledon. Since the other party wasn't a fraud, they also had no reason to refuse the new king's envoy. Otherwise it was equivalent to declaring the new king, and the kingdom of Grey Castle as their enemy. And in case this news were to spread out, the other families would certainly come to target the honeysuckle territory without any hesitation, and the currently suppressed undercurrent would instantly rebound. However, since Timothy had only sent 50 people to inquire about the situation in the Western Territory, one of the prince's speculation had been confirmed. The new king, at present, was unable to rule over the Western Territory. Since the prince, His Royal Highness, was able to repel the Duke's coalition who had more than 1,000 soldiers, I'm afraid that these 50 people can only return without having any achievement. Of course, His Highness has to be informed about this development as soon as possible. Thinking until here, he called the knight from before, Westeros, take 3 short-tailed horses with you, interchange them during the ride, so that you can reach Border Town as early as possible. When you're there, tell His Highness that Timothy's men have come. As you bid, Westeros nodded. As the knight turned around and left, Petrov sighed. Let's go and meet the new king's envoy. When Petrov appeared at the city gate, with the exception of the 10 people riding at the front, whose spirits seemed to be trembling with excitement, the rest of the cavaliers all seemed a little sluggish. They were sitting with a crooked body on their horses, as if they could fall off any time. Welcome, Sir Lehman, Petrov welcomed him with a nod. I'm the stronghold manager belonging to the Honeysuckle family, Petrov Hull. The word stronghold manager left a bad aftertaste in his mouth. If he had really been in charge of the western border, being the Duke of the Stronghold, he would never have had to salute towards an envoy. He wouldn't even need to greet him at the gate. Instead, he could just stay inside the Lord's castle, waiting for the other party to come to him. I have heard of your name at the Cold Wind Range, acting Duke. Lehman dismounted and walked over with a smile. The western border is indeed a strange territory. Even after assembling a vast army, Duke Ryan actually couldn't conquer such a small town. Moreover, he even lost his own life, which is a rare circumstance for the Kingdom of Grey Castle. Of course, for the Honeysuckle family, this must have been good news. Petrov automatically ignored the irony coming from his words. Are your men all right? They look to be a little unwell. Don't mind them, Lehman glanced backward. They probably haven't acclimatized themselves after rushing through the whole journey. They will be better after some rest. To be honest, this region is just too hot. It's only because the north is too cold. Since the other person seemed to not to care about the matter, Petrov was too lazy to pay attention further to the subject. I'm wondering why Sir Envoy has come from the Cold Wind Range, rather than from King's City. That is because His Majesty Timothy Wimbledon is currently in the Northern Territory, Lehman answered bluntly. Duke Essie had thought he could take advantage of the weakened state of the Northern Border Guards to instigate a rebellion. After being suspected of starting a revolution, King Timothy had no other choice than to put down the revolt. Rebellion? Perrault frowned. That does not meet with common sense. Although the border guards were put together of knights and mercenaries from all over the kingdom, most of the members were still the Duke's own men. So how could it be that he had substantial losses created by the rebellion? Remembering the letter within Duke Ryan had written about his plans to annex the north, Petrov created a bad image within his mind. Could it be that Timothy Wimbledon had the same kind of idea? That being the case, what is the king's current decision? He has issued a recall order, Lehman stated. His Majesty sent me to see if the Western Territory has also sunken into a state of chaos, caused by war. If I remember correctly, prior to the months of demons, the king had sent a recall order to Roland Wimbledon, but until today he still hasn't returned to King's City. The instruments should have been forwarded to the stronghold 5 months ago, but unlike the previous lords, Lord Roland didn't choose to return to the stronghold and take refuge here during the months of demons. Petrov paused. He decided to instead stay inside Border Town and lead his people against the demonic beasts. So, for that reason he couldn't immediately set out to King's City and follow the king's orders. By now the end of the months of demons had been almost 3 months ago. Lehman didn't waver in his duty. The king has sent me to escort the prince back to King's City. When will you leave for Border Town? We will set out tomorrow morning. Traveling at a regular pace, they should arrive at Border Town in 3 days, while my knight will move through day and night, and should be able to deliver the message after only 1 night and day. This way His Royal Highness should have enough time to prepare to deal with them. I, Petrov, can only do so much. When the group reached the stronghold's barracks, Petrov stopped. This is the place where the Duke's knights were stationed, so staying here you should get a good rest. Dinner will be sent later to you. As for Sir Lehman, Petrov looked at Lehman Hawes. There will be a hearty dinner prepared for you, please be sure to attend. Thank you for your generosity, Sir Petrov, the latter laughed. Asterisk. After dinner, when Lehman returned to camp and stepped into the central tent, he was immediately surrounded by several people. What's the situation? He asked. We are surrounded on all sides by people who are keeping a close watch over us. They have also stationed around 100 troops at the gates, but most of them don't possess a whole armor, so they should belong to the city patrol, one of his men reported. It seems that the Lord doesn't trust us. At least it appeared that our intelligence was correct. The information I gathered at the banquet also confirmed this point. Lehman spoke in a hushed tone. After the Duke was defeated, most of the knights were arrested and brought to Border Town, so there aren't many knights left for them to use in combat. Before he had arrived here, he had gathered detailed intelligence about the current situation in Longsong Stronghold. The task given by His Majesty was very simple, which was, to discover the reasons for the Duke's loss, and then to take the appropriate measures to gain control over the Western Territory as quickly as possible. What's with those who took that medicine? They will soon reach their limit, said the other. As long as we give them pills, they will do anything. The messenger group was also only a pretext. Of their team of 50, the numbers of real knights were only counted at 13, the other were mercenaries disguised as knights. Under the influence of the church's pills, they were more obedient than the loyalist of hounds, while at the same time being even more ferocious than demonic beasts. They were also the key to Lehman's plan in capturing the gate. According to his plan, a 1,500 people strong militia were slowly nearing the stronghold, and as long as they opened the gates, the city would fall into their hands. Hand out the pills, then have 10 men stay behind to deal with the patrol and send the others to the east gate. Lehman finally gave his orders. Chapter 193 Castle Bathroom. The theater performance was a great success. Within the last 2 weeks Cinderella had been performed 3 times, many of the citizens had even seen it more than once. If the first performance was the needed propaganda and announcement to attract so many people to come watch, the next 2 plays were completely self-sustaining. There were even citizens who came to the city hall and asked when the 4th performance would be held. Getting such a response, Roland was naturally overjoyed. They were all so completely attracted to the story that almost no one raised any objections as to why Cinderella got help from a witch. Wait until The Rooster Crows at Midnight gets played next month, which was almost a special performance for the impoverished commoners. It was still unknown how the serfs would view the treatment and assistance of the witches during the drama. Another thing that pleased Roland was that the crew had settled down in town and even accepted the existence of the witches. After the 3rd performance, Irene took the initiative to find Roland, and had asked him from where the unexpected sound accompaniment had come, so Roland then introduced Echo to her. With Nightingale's secret observation, they discovered that although Irene was clearly surprised, she didn't show any resentment or disgust. After she regained her composure, she seemed to be very curious and peppered Echo with many questions, even making her demonstrate her magical sounds several times over. The result being that Echo soon joined the theater group, becoming the master of music who was orchestrating from behind the scenes. In order to avoid the possibility of any accidents, Irene alone paired up with Echo when they did a sound rehearsal, withholding it from the knowledge of the cast. There was no doubt that the musical accompaniment would soon reach new heights at the upcoming performance. Another matter that made him jubilant was that the castle would soon step into the era of tap water. The towering water tower stood tall and upright in the castle backyard. Its body and framework was made out of welded iron, giving it a triangular shape. Attached to the top of the tower, with a diameter of 2 meters and a height of 3 meters, was an iron bucket. The water valve within the bucket made it very convenient to control the water level. The tower was welded by Anna and afterward covered by a rust-proof coating by Soraya, and finally, with the help of Hummingbird's magic, they eliminated most of the weight in order to install it on the previous erected cement base. Due to the height of the castle, the water tower in the castle backyard was even higher than Redwater River's river bank. With a height of 12 meters it was almost level with the castle's peak. In order to prevent the tower from collapsing, Roland surrounded the tower by a wall and in this way connected the tower with the castle. The steam engine was set up outside the backyard and used to supply the water tower with water by pumping up water from the well in the castle's back garden. Taking a closer look, it could be seen that it was already the third generation of the steam engine, with the biggest improvement being the great reduction of the working noise. At each connection point of the steam engine, a spacer was equipped. The light blue spacer was drawn with Soraya's sky coloring, making it soft while also being very though, significantly reducing the machine's vibrational noise. The inside of the cylinder and the piston's edge were covered with a grass coloring, which lessened the leakage while at the same time also improved the operational efficiency. Components that were prone to tremors, such as the exhaust pipe, had been entirely replaced with coated hoses. In order to prevent the steamer from getting scorched and drenched by sun and rain, as well as for further noise reduction, Roland built a small house around it, and had Soraya coat all of the inner walls with a honeycomb design, which was used like a porous sound absorption material. The practical test showed that even during the night, the noise of the machine would be so faint that the people sleeping inside wouldn't be woken up. However, Roland's attempt to automatically feed the steam engine failed. He originally envisaged that the steam engine would be regulated by a fly ball which would control the valve in the wood box. As the steam pressure dropped, the fly ball was meant to open the valve, so that the firewood in the wood box would roll into the furnace, but that way the regulator would have to do a lot of work, otherwise with the weight of the fly ball alone it couldn't drive the valve. After a lot of deliberation, Roland finally decided to give up. At the beginning, the wood box would have to be filled to the maximum, and when it was used up it had to be filled again by a workforce anyway. In that case would be better to arrange for staff to just fill the water tank with water each day. The final step was to install the water system into the castle, which included faucets, showers, pipes and the corresponding drain pipes. The castle wasn't like the brick houses of the newly constructed district. The holes, roofs and walls built out of stone caused the transformation of the castle to be very inconvenient. So this step had taken nearly a week, but in order to live a happy life, Roland personally directed Carl to change one room on the second and the third floor into a bathroom. For this, Soraya's new ability once again played a vital role. After the drainage pipes on the ground were paved with cement, she painted a thin layer of grass over the ground, not only making it waterproof, but in this way walking in the bathroom was like also as comfortable as walking on grassland. When she'd done this, Roland directly permitted her to coat the whole room, turning the ceiling into a blue sky and clouds, while on the surrounding walls far-off valley and grassy areas could be seen and the walls of the bathtub became crystal clear, just like a jewel. On the day at which the water system was working, the prince called all of the witches to the bathroom to let them finally experience for themselves this wondrous achievement. The water tank in the backyard was filled with water, so when he turned on the faucet, the water rushed out of the pipe. From now on, there is no longer the need to get the water from the well, Roland proudly proclaimed. It is not necessary to use the same bathwater for 3 days. You only have to stand under the shower and pull the lever. Where does the water come from? Lightning stuck out her tongue and tasted the water. It's sweet. From below Lighting, Macy stretched out her head and followed her example. Very sweet goo. Seeing a third one trying to taste the water, Roland stopped. Nana, those who want to drink water can only do so after it has been boiled. The water from this can only be used for hand washing and bathing. This is the siphon principle, right? Anna looked to Roland, her lake-like blue eyes flashed with intelligence. What is that? Hummingbird asked as she raised her hand. Under Scroll's teaching, every witch in the class had gotten used to the habit of raising their hand whenever they had a question. Elementary physics says when the level in 2 containers is not equal, and if the 2 tanks are connected by a pipe, no matter what shape the pipe has, under the force of gravity the liquid will always level out. Anna explained what she remembered. Our current position is lower than the water tower, so the water will continue to flow to here. That's entirely correct, Roland praised. Being able to link the learned knowledge with the reality really was worthy of a talented person. What about this? Nightingale asked, curiously pointing to the shower. Why does it have so many holes in the bottom? Roland turned the valve open, letting thin water droplets spray out. It's for the purpose of making it easier for people to take a bath. Just by standing under the shower, an individual can easily clean their body. So that was the reason you were rolling around in the castle this whole week, to make it more comfortable to take a bath? Lily curled her lips and whispered, "It's really worthy of the luxurious life of a lord." "Lily!" Scroll scolded with a frown. "Never mind," Roland waved his hand, indicating that he did not mind her words. "The pursuit of enjoyment is one of the biggest sources of human progress, and I am not an exception to that." Chapter 194 Lily. Not long after the prince returned to his office, Scroll, following after him, also entered the room. "Your Highness, I'm sorry, Lily, that child, it was not on purpose." "I don't mind what she said," he smiled, "after all, she is still a little girl." "Only His Highness is so tolerant of us," Scroll sighed. "At first, she wasn't like this, but after she was deceived, it is hard for her to believe in ordinary people again." "Are you speaking about something that happened to her before she joined the Witch Cooperation Association?" Roland asked. "If I remember it correctly, it was 1 year ago that she had joined you. You already know that I can feel the existence of magic. The closer I come to the source, the more intense the feeling will become. Though it is not like Nightingale's sense, that allows her to directly see the shape and color of the magic, I can at least use it to detect new witches. So whenever we reached a new town, I will go to the local shelters or orphanages and pretend to be an aristocratic wife who wants to adopt a child, looking if I may be able to find an awakened sister." She paused. "I found Lily in a shelter in a remote village, but when I expressed my intention of wanting to adopt her, I was rejected by the owner of the shelter, who declared that he would only sell the girls after they have become adults." "Why?" Roland already had his doubt. "The last chance for a girl to awaken as a witch is on her day of adulthood, is that the reason?" "We were also surprised at that time, so we had Nightingale sneak into the shelter and search for books, records, and related information. Fortunately, the shelter was far from town, so we could stay there for a long time." "With Nightingale's ability, why didn't you just take Lily away? With her ability it shouldn't have been too difficult, right?" "It wouldn't have been difficult," Scroll nodded in response. "With the exception of the god stone of retaliation that the operator wore, there was no other stone within the whole shelter, but we still couldn't do that. After all, there was a precedent for that." "What precedent?" The prince filled a cup of tea and handed it to Scroll. "Thank you." Scroll took the teacup. "At first, as soon as we detected a witch, we would take her by force, but after what happened in the Seawind region we had to change our way of thinking. They thought of us as evil, so when we brought them to the camp of our Witch Cooperation Association, they wouldn't listen to us or accept our explanation and would instead try to attack us. In the end, 2 of our sisters died. They were killed by Kara's magical snake, Death. And since then, we would always carefully observe the witch over a period of time, and determine her situation and get to know her beliefs before we would take action. In case we were chased by the church and had to act urgently, we had no other choice than to give up on them." "So, the meeting between Nightingale and Wendy wasn't by accident?" "Of course not." Scroll took another sip of her tea, smiled and shook her head. "The interval of becoming aware of Nightingale's existence until Wendy made contact with her, more than 1 month's time had passed, during which we also recruited other sisters, such as Red Pepper and Windseeker." Speaking until here her expression turned blank. "Unfortunately, they are now buried in the wildlands. At that time, if we had only chosen to settle in Border Town, they could still be alive today." Roland also felt quite sorry for them. If the Witch Cooperation Association had decided to settle down in Border Town and had brought their more than 40 witches with them, I think it is entirely possible that we would already have entered modern life by now. But right now we weren't speaking about them. Scroll took a deep breath. "We were talking about Lily. During the search of the shelter as well as following the host's tracks, we discovered an astonishing fact. The small country house was neither a real shelter, nor was it an establishment to screen for witches." "Then what was its purpose?" "Its only purpose was to satisfy the owner's selfish desire." Even for a person with a good self-control like Scroll, when speaking these words her facial expression became somewhat dreary. Every week the owner would go to the slums of Redwater City, abducting those vagrant girls, and deceive them by saying that he was a kind and selfless aristocrat, who had opened up a shelter in the suburb. Furthermore, his shelter would often be visited by powerful nobles who were looking for girls to be adopted as daughters. As long as they were selected, they would no longer need to worry about food and clothing for the rest of their life. Of course, not everyone would be deceived by his sweet words, but, after 10 years of running, in addition to the 66 who still lived in the shelter, there were still several hundreds of names written in his books. So many? Roland frowned. But you said that it was not such a big shelter. Hundreds of them now only remain as names in those books. Most of them were already dead, she whispered. During the last 10 years, he had discovered 3 witches, who were all sold to the church. While the other girls who had better appearance got dressed up nicely and then sold to people who had a need of them. However, those who no one had any interest in were killed and buried in the woods behind the shelter. Hearing her story, the prince didn't know how to respond. At that moment he suddenly felt from his back, someone gently place their hands on his shoulders. The chances that a girl awakens to become a witch is not high, so after reducing the living cost, within all the years, he hadn't earned more than 20 gold royals, based on the data we were able to gather from his accounting book. Because of those 20 gold royals, more than 300 women had lost their life in the woods, filling the pit in the woods with corpses. When Kara had interrogated him why he did this, he'd said that it had never been his intention to earn gold royals, that was only to keep the shelter running. Because of this, he only sold them when they became adults. After all, a witch could be sold at a much higher price than an ordinary woman. His only goal was to enjoy the power to decide about life and death and to feel the pleasure of forcefully taking it away, giving him the feeling as if he had become their king. Afterwards, Kara killed him in anger, and when we later wanted to dispel the girls from their belief, most of them only glared at us as if we had taken away their chance of being adopted by a noble. At first the same was true for Lily, and only after Kara took her to the grove behind the building, where she then saw her friend was buried. A month ago the owner had lied and said that she was one of those lucky girls who were selected by a noble and with that could leave the shelter. Soon after seeing the several corpses in the already stinking pit, Lily threw up and turned into a total mess, fainting and falling into Kara's arms. Later when she awoke her look had become stupefied, without any trace of spirit left in her eyes. She was only later under Wendy's care that she was slowly able to recover. Since then, Lily is full of vigilance and distrust to ordinary people, especially the aristocracy. Scroll explained, but I believe that she will be able to slowly change her point of view. After all, you are also a member of the nobility. So, that's the reason. In his heart Roland secretly sighed, after experiencing this kind of event, being able to once more cheer up, her spirit must be considerably tough. Scroll went over to the kettle and filled up their 2 cups. Afterward, the room was silent for a long time until she said, "Your Highness, I have a question I want to ask you." "What question?" Seeing the serious expression on Scroll's face, Roland got started. "Nightingale, are you there?" "Well," Nightingale said, "do you need me to leave?" "No, you already know about it anyway." Scroll shook her head, "So you can accompany me this time, and be my witness. You previously said that you were willing to take a witch as your wife and marry her, but I do not know if you know that a witch is unable to conceive a child." She paused, and after a moment she finally asked, "Your Highness, even if it is like this, is there still no change to your original intention?" Chapter 195 Answer. Roland doubted if what he had heard was right, so after a while, he was only able to say, "What?" Scroll bit her lip and repeated what she'd said once more. This time he was convinced that this wasn't the result of a hearing problem. Was that also the reason why the witches initially cared so much about the marriage? "Are you certain that witches cannot have children? Does it come from that specified source which lead to the known mistake? For example, the same as what lead to the holy mountain previously?" "I would have hoped so too," she sighed. "Unfortunately, many cases have already confirmed this point. Whether it was between an ordinary man and a witch who got along well or forced intercourse, there has been no time that the Witch Cooperation Association had heard of where a witch has become pregnant." Reproductive isolation was the first word which emerged in Roland's mind. Can it be that the witches have really completely exceeded the ordinary, becoming a new kind of human species, which is unable to give birth to a descendant with our old humankind? Or, can it be because of the magic power gathered within their body, which results in this phenomenon? But now isn't the time to get to the heart of the problem, he thought. The important part is what this implies. Will this knowledge be a hindrance for myself if I want to marry a witch? The first person Roland thought of was Anna. Although he couldn't deny that he would regret it if he couldn't have children with Anna, his wish to raise a child with Anna was based on his affection for her, so not being able to have a child with her wouldn't reduce his affection. For a person with a modern soul, and for him, having blood relation with his descendants is of far less importance than it was to the people of the past. As a separate living individual, he does not regard his child as the continuation of his life. The latter could neither inherit his thoughts nor inherit his memories. Instead, they were an entirely independent person. So, looking at it from an emotional point of view, he could accept that a witch cannot have a child. Then only the real obstacle would be the need for an heir. However, looking at the history, this was still not a thorny matter. He just has to establish an empire that doesn't need an heir, and how to achieve this. There were options he could choose from, but which one he would pick he could slowly decide on later. Looking at the big picture, Roland surprisingly discovered that this was good news for him. He and Nightingale had already spoken several nights and pondered on this question: how to build a social framework which allows witches and ordinary people to peacefully coexist and progress together. Right now, even with the Godstone of retaliation, as long as they had enough time, witches and their offspring would always form a more powerful community, even in the case where science and technology allowed an ordinary person to use magic. Even then, it couldn't make up for the witches' increased intelligence, memory, comprehensive speed, and their overall leading edge. But now he was told that witches are unable to give birth. This significantly avoided the problem of forming witch clans, closing the gap between witches and ordinary people, giving him the hope to one day see people and witches work together and advance hand in hand. Perhaps the time he had been lost in his thoughts was too long. No matter what, Nightingale couldn't bear it any longer and squeezed his arm. When Roland returned from within his thoughts, he reassuringly patted the back of her hand and cleared his throat and said, "The way I have thought before is still the way I think now." For a moment Scroll was frozen. What? The hand on top of his arm also instantly grasped firmly. Seeing their reactions, Roland couldn't suppress his laughter. Previous it was he who had thought that he had misheard them, and now it was them who thought so? He coughed twice and then reassuring said, "I still think the same. I'm willing to marry a witch and take her as my wife." When Scroll left the room she wore a very strange expression. It looked as if she was perfectly contented, and yet she was also carrying a somewhat sad look, leaving behind a confused Roland. Needing an explanation, he turned around. He asked, "Is she okay?" The one he spoke to didn't answer. She only looked at him with a smile, which together with the outside sunshine shining upon her white face gave her a gentle, bright and beautiful appearance, causing others' hearts to beat faster. "All right," Roland moved his line of sight away from her. "It seems you are in a pretty good mood." At this moment, the voice from outside the door traveled over. "Your Highness, one of Longsong Stronghold's knights has arrived. He claims to have crucial news for you. Take him to the reception hall. I will meet him there." When the prince walked into the hall, the knight immediately stepped over and then went down on his knees. "Lord Petrov has sent me to tell you that an envoy sent by Timothy Wimbledon has arrived at Longsong Stronghold." "Envoy?" Roland mused. "How many people have arrived?" "Altogether there are about 50 people. It seems that they are just a group which wants to persuade us to give up," he thought. "Simply a diplomatic strategy, nothing which should be painful or itching for me." "When did they come?" "Yesterday morning." The knight lowered his voice. "Lord Petrov gave me the order to inform you as soon as possible." Merely a day and a night. I'm afraid he had hurried all through the night while holding up a torch. "Thank you, I have put you to a lot of trouble. Rest for a day before you return." Roland looked to the guards and told them, "First give him a gold royal as reward and then take him to the inn." When the knight had left the hall, Roland wanted to put the matter aside. After all, a team of just 50 people could never become a threat to Border Town. In case they wanted to negotiate, he would merely allow the single leader to enter. However, since Petrov treated this situation so carefully, it might be better to grasp the situation himself and to know the whereabouts of the envoy. Thinking until here, he called for Lightning and Maggie, giving them the order to fly together to the stronghold and examine the situation. A double hour later, the two witches had completed their investigation and returned to the castle. There was nothing to see, Lightning reported. We didn't see a group of 50 knights on the road. Actually, we didn't see even one lone knight. Haven't seen anyone, phew. Maggie confirmed. It seems after they had reached a big city, traveling such a long distance, they were in need to first have some fun for themselves and to ease their tired body. Before the envoy arrive here, Roland ordered, every day you two will fly along the way and check if you can discover anything. He paused, oh that's right, how far are you with the map? Probably she has already put together several hundred pieces, they are enough to almost fill Soraya's whole room, Lightning explained. By now she had moved the map to the backyard, do you want to take a look? Alright, Roland laughed. The castle's backyard had been turned into a botanical garden. Ever since Sean had brought back the seeds from Port of Clearwater, Leaves had created even more fantastic oddities of every description. In order to save the land and place for flower beds, Leaves had put up a wooden frame in the sky, so that many plants grew and twisted around the frame like a grapevine, some of them even climbed half of the castle wall. This was the reason why the wall behind the castle hung full with grapes, apples, wheat and sugar cane, and whenever the witches had some free time, they would gather in the backyard and picked up some fruit and sugar cane from the wall to eat. Unfortunately, these crops could only grow with the help of Leaves' magic, and with this, could only be regarded as an unsuccessful test. The map, which was a mosaic, pieced together by many parchments, was placed at the center of the yard, reaching a size of 5 to 6 square meters. Here we are, Lightning announced, and then put an arm around Roland's waist, beginning to slowly float into the sky until they were hovering over the map. Do you see the palm-sized brown square? From high up in the air, Border Town looks exactly like that. The blue pieces east and south, are they the sea? Yes, but you have to climb over the mountains to reach there. Roland felt a cold shiver running through his heart. If we say that it was still normal if the wildlands were 10 times more vast than the kingdom of Grey Castle, he still hadn't expected that when he had the complete map in front of him, the Western Territory would actually seem so small. In front of them was the impassable mountain range and behind them the sea, just like they were sandwiched between a natural barrier and the marginal zone. No, not only the Western Territory. When he completed the undrawn parts of the map with his mind, in the case where he thought of the impassable mountain range as a wall splitting of the mainland, then the kingdom of Grey Castle, no, the whole mainland itself, would be nothing more than a small piece of land behind the wall. Chapter 196 The Calamity of the Church. Lehman and his knights rode their horses through the streets of Longsong Stronghold. Now, after the fighting had come to an end, the city's residents were all hiding in their houses and keeping their doors shut. Not even half a shadow could be seen on the streets, making a cold and cheerless image. Sir Lehman, I hope that your hand is all right, the Shield Knight, Sir Levin asked. It's not a problem, Lehman Haas shrugged his shoulders, at least I can still move it. However, that small movement was already enough to make him wrinkle his brows. Last night's seizure of the gate had went smoothly, only 20 guards had been stationed at the east gate. They never expected that the enemy's attack would come from the inside. Even though they were able to sound the horn, the reinforcements had still needed a quarter of an hour to arrive. By then, the 15 mercenaries, enhanced with the pills, had already reached the top of the gate, killing one guard after another and thus allowing Lehman with his knights to open the gate. Under the darkness of night, Lehman hadn't noticed the side door in the city wall from which 2 knights had suddenly appeared, the one armed with a hammer immediately throwing himself at Lehman. In order to lessen the swinging power of the hammer, he had to take the hammer's blow before it reached his waist. Under such a hasty situation, Lehman was merely able to use his arm to resist, and almost at the same time using his sword with his other hand to pierce into the guard's waist. Affected by the impact of the fatal blow, the incoming hammer lost a lot of its strength, but it was still strong enough to leave behind a noticeable dent on his arm's armor piece. At first, Lehman hadn't felt much pain. However, after they had conquered the gate, he noticed that he had problems with lifting his arm. When he unlocked the armor, he discovered that his forearm had already swollen up like a rolling pin. "I hope there's an analgesic herb in the church," Levin said. "They often prepare some strange things. Like those pills, for example." Dwayne, another knight who happens to be near, said. Soon, the knights reached the church's gate, and a team of around 100 militia could already be seen waiting for them, showing off a look full of desire. "Hand out some pills to them," Lehman dismounted from his horse. When he saw that everyone had taken the pills, he turned around, climbed the stairs and led his team to the main hall. "Halt!" the two gatekeepers shouted. "This is holy land, no one is allowed to bring their weapons inside." Levin pulled out his weapon and placed it in both his hands to hand it over. "We are aware of that, this should be given to you, right?" When the believer stretched out his hands, ready to receive the weapon, Levin suddenly and masterfully grasped the sword's hilt, then slashed his sword upwards, sending the believer's two hands falling to the ground. Even before the believer's sorrowful cry could fully emerge from his throat, the knight had already pierced the tip of his sword through it. Even though Levin's nickname was Shield, his quick sword draw was truly unmatched. After the other believer's throat was cut open by Dwayne, Lehman kicked open the door and expressionless entered the hall. "Who are you?" A middle-aged man wearing a blue and white ritual gown walked up to them, not showing a trace of fear as he faced the bloody sword which was pointed at him, daring to have the impertinence to break into the church. "Children, grab them." Lehman sneered. Right now, most people were at home, so there were no more than 20 to 30 believers inside the church. Having to face his battle-hardened knights, their rebellion would only be a doomed cause. Not waiting for his order, with a devilish laugh Dwayne pulled his sword, cutting down one of the believers that was rushing over. Other people also quickly joined the battle, turning the church into a scene of chaos. Seeing the situation, the priest shouted, "Children, take the holy medicine so that God will give you the power to defeat the mob." His Majesty Timothy's guess was right, Lehman thought. They really did have pills stored in here. Merely to see how the believer's eyes suddenly turned red through and through, and on the believer's face blue veins were blossoming. With those drugs, an ordinary person could break through the human body's limit of strength and speed. Furthermore, the narrower the terrain, the more challenging it would be to deal with them. Unfortunately for them, they aren't the only ones who possess those things, he thought. Now have a taste of your own medicine. "Get out," he yelled, "make the militia fight against them." Hearing his shout, the militia behind him couldn't wait to swallow those two colored pills and madly rush forward to fight against the believer. Seeing all this, the priest's face finally lost his color. "Why do you also have the holy medicine?" Holding his sword in his hand, Lehman bypassed the group of fighting people, closing in towards his counterpart. "They were a present from your church, and if we hadn't to face your obstacles, His Majesty Timothy would have already unified the kingdom of Grey Castle." "His Majesty?" The priest's eyes became wide. "You are Timo." With a grunting sound his voice stopped, the knight's sword pierced the man's chest, penetrating his heart and lung. Soon after, the unequal fight ended and there were more than 20 believers slaughtered with their bodies spread all over the ground. The further the drug efficacy vanished, the heavier the soldiers began to breathe, so when they were finally able to sit down, they were so satisfied that they didn't mind to sit in the blood which was endlessly flowing over the ground. Lehman's arm also became heavier, just as previous sword stroke was enough to make him experience a tearing pain. Sometimes, he also wanted to swallow that black pill, let himself ignore the physical fatigue and suffering, but whenever he saw the pill's ugly side effects, this idea would immediately vanish. Lehman had a profound understanding of the two pills that were sold by the church. For a healthy person, the pill would only be effective for 3 times. While the first time it was still effective for a quarter hour, the duration would decrease with every following dose, at the same time forming a heavy dependence on it. If you were unable to take the medicine for a long time, the body would gradually decline until finally, death. Taking advantage of this characteristic, he let every one of the soldiers eat a pill to unify the militia, in this way forcing them to obey his orders. The craving for the drug could turn even the weakest farmer into a bloodthirsty beast. Now, after the 100 people had taken the pill for the second time, they could only be used one more time. But, even if the drug is taken after the third dosage, it will only slow the process, it still cannot reverse its damage. In other words, as soon as one takes the first pill, it is equivalent to setting their first foot into the coffin. Of course, this was something he would never explain to them. There is no doubt that the two-color secret medicine is a conspiracy of the Church. His Majesty Timothy is apparently aware of this, and because of this, he prohibited all of the knights from taking it. However, it is also a weapon which can be used to unify the kingdom, or, rather, must be used. Without it, His Majesty cannot overcome Garcia Wimbledon, who also has those pills with her. When His Majesty mentioned this matter to him for the first time, Lehman couldn't believe it. He just couldn't understand why the Church would support two members of the royal family who were competing against each other for the throne. But after a series of unforeseen events, he had to acknowledge His Majesty's judgment. And now, with the Church in the Western Territory also in possession of the pills, he no longer had any doubt. The Church doesn't intend to help any of the princes or princess to the throne. No, they want the entire kingdom of Grey Castle for themselves. We found the pills in the basement. There are 4 large boxes, with thousands in all of them. After thoroughly plundering the church, Levin excitedly came back to report, there were also gold royals, jewelry, and many silk fabrics, all of which should be the donations given by believers. What can be taken, take away, and what can't be taken, burn, Lehman instructed. In case someone asks, Roland Wimbledon was the one who did all of this. We're just helping the church to suppress his rebellion. Because we still have to rely on the church to get the secret medicine, so, for now, we can't burn all of our bridges with them. It is better if we blame the prince for it, since he can already be considered dead. In order to prevent the church from becoming suspicious, His Majesty himself had stayed in the north, pretending to comply with their fake instruction. He'd only secretly sent out a small number of knights, who recruited a large number of militia to capture the Western Territory. Nowadays, all the forces of the church are concentrated in the Wolfshark Kingdom, so we have to unite the kingdom of Grey Castle as soon as possible, only then will we have the strength to resist an attack of the church. His Majesty Timothy believes that it is only a matter of time before the church attacks the kingdom of Grey Castle. So until then, we have to store and collect as many pills as possible. At the same time, he has also ordered King's City Alchemy Association to research its ingredients, so that they could become able to imitate it. Now that we have the pills in our hand, there is only one task left, completely eliminating Roland Wimbledon. Chapter 197 Preparing for the Enemy. On the next morning, Roland was informed that Lightning, on one of her routine patrols, had discovered that there was a large force slowly closing in on them. What, they have more than 1,000 people? Hearing such a large number startled Roland. Wasn't I told that it was only a 50 people strong envoy? Goo, Maggie added, there aren't many people that are riding on horses, only 6. The people who are walking, how are they dressed and equipped? They seem ordinary, most of them don't possess a helmet or armor. They're wearing normal linen clothes instead, Lightning reported. Furthermore, they all have different kinds of weapons, but there are hundreds of people who are carrying short spears on their back. With such a poor level of equipment, does that mean they are civilians or serfs who were forced into serving? Roland questioned this. During this era they had no specialized militia training. This was also the reason why the militia usually only belonged to the logistic team and handled the food and supplies of the knights. While they were also sometimes used as cannon fodder, as a target for the enemy's arrows. If Timothy wants to use military force to dispose of me, it should be impossible that he doesn't know about the explosive fight between Border Town and Longsong Stronghold. That time, Duke Ryan's coalition of more than 200 knights could not even touch the town's edge, not to mention that crowd of mercenaries who would have to run on both of their legs. Knowing about the fight's process and eventual result, yet still wanting to attack Border Town, this can only mean that they have confidence that they can break through the intensive row of gunfire. Roland could not help but think of the church's pills. Previous he had already guessed that the church was supporting Garcia and himself at the same time, but whether they also favored Timothy was still unknown. If that troop was in possession of those pills, the situation would be entirely different. For a short time they would be able to reach the speed of a running horse, while also not being afraid of pain, meaning, the gun line would actually face an impact of more than 1,000 knights, and as long as one person managed to rush into the lines, they could cause significant casualties to the First Army. Fortunately, the First Army now was no longer the First Army of 2 months ago. With the revolving rifle, although until now only 100 had been replaced, the firepower they could deliver went far beyond that of the previous flintlock army, especially after he'd provided the gunners with a special ammunition loader. As soon as they enter into a scope of 300 meters, the enemy would have to face a constant stream of attacks. Furthermore, after the fight with the stronghold, the artillery force has also been expanded. From its original size of 4 to its current size 20 groups, each was equipped with a modified version of the 12-pounder field cannon, doubling its range. Its effective range was increased to over a kilometer. However, Roland soon thought of another problem. Have you noticed if any one of those soldiers that were walking was wearing a godstone of retaliation? I didn't dare to get so close, Lightning said, then pointed at Maggie. But this fellow, after she had turned into her eagle form, she could see them many times better than I could. But the latter also shook her head. Haven't seen, they might have hidden it in their clothes. Phew. If it's like this, for a moment Roland pondered about it, how about you take Nightingale with you? If you only carry one person while flying, you can still reach a height of 10 meters, right? You will follow the Redwater River, Maggie will fly in front of you and take responsible of being on guard. As for the possibility of coming across a ship, Nightingale will step into her world of fog, he said, then he looked at Nightingale. When you are close enough to the enemy, you will observe them from distance. Find out if the troops are carrying God's Stone of Retaliations. However, without my permission, you will not attack. Yes, Nightingale and Lightning said simultaneously. When the three were ready to go, Roland stopped them one more time. Remember, safety first, the most important thing is that you protect yourself. No problem, Nightingale said with a wink and smile. When the witches had left, Roland felt a little uneasy. Wasn't the last sentence too much like raising a flag? But he also became aware of a major mistake he had made, which was, that his intelligence control within the Longsong stronghold was too weak. If it weren't for the messenger sent by Petrov, he would only become aware of the enemy after it had already hit his door. Once a street fight broke out, the First Army would lose its advantage of firepower, and it would be difficult to get the advantage back. I'm too young, too simple, Roland thought. After the war, this has to be changed. Not only our intelligence system, Petrov should also be placed in my own staff. In the following time, Roland sat restlessly at his table. Even when it was time for lunch he wasn't in the mood to eat. Only when Lightning, carrying Nightingale, flew in a fairy-like manner into his room was he able to breath out in relief. Maggie closed her wings, dropped on Nightingale's shoulders and chirped in a high voice, "Doesn't exist goo, doesn't exist goo. They have no God's Stone of Retaliation? Most of them don't possess them," Nightingale said, taking off her hood, freeing her golden flood. "I have observed them from the front to the end, and I could only detect 3 to 4 black holes from the ranks of the militia." "Very well," Roland said, immediately forming a preliminary battle plan. "You all should be hungry by now. In that case, go to the dining hall and order whatever you want to eat from the chef." "Honey sauce barbecue, goo." Maggie chirped, spread her wing and flew ahead. Asterisk. East of border town. Danner glanced at the stonemasons and workers who were busying themselves at both sides of the road. In the end, what is it that they are building? In the beginning hundreds of people had dug out several huge pits in the ground, and they then built a brick wall at the edge of the pits. He thought that the walls would be connected, cutting off the road this way, so he never expected that they would actually be built around the pit. "Don't worry about it, I only know that there is finally another enemy we can beat," Jop said excitedly while setting up the cannon on the right spot. Indeed, how satisfying that would be. Last time when we had defeated the Duke's coalition, His Royal Highness had personally awarded U.S. members of the artillery group with a bronze emblem. No, that's wrong, it was a medal. The Longsong stronghold's wall was depicted on the front of the medal, while the back was engraved with the year and their accomplishment. It was an exquisite production and had led to a lot of envy from the others within the firearms squadron. And as if that wasn't already enough honor, they had also been promoted. Vanner was now an artillery captain, and was in charge of 10 artillery groups. The Rodney brothers, Cat Claus and Jop, were promoted to team captains, with 3 of them transferred to newly formed groups, where they were in charge to teaching the newly enlisted gunners how to operate the cannon. However, the most inspiring was that the prince, His Highness, has honored his promise, and had assigned a piece of land, which lay east of the town, at the foot of the impassable mountain range, to him. Even though it was only a forest for now, but on the ground there now stood a stele, symbolizing that this piece and the rights to its use belonged to him. So when they had learned that an enemy wanted to invade Border Town, the First Army suddenly began to boil. Everyone was fully motivated, and hoped to gain some merits within the battle. When the evening came and the day's drill finally came to its end, Vanner wiped the sweat from his forehead, and sat down on the shelves to take a little rest. During the whole afternoon he had gone from one artillery group to another, checking whether the new recruits were following the rules and execution steps when firing. He had yelled so much that his throat was nearly on fire. "Drink something," Jop handed him a leather flask. "Thank you." Vanner twisted open the lid, drinking thirstily. "I think I know what they're going to build," said the former, raising his lips, proudly. "Is that so?" He gave the leather bag back to Jop. By now the brick wall has been piled up to half a person's height, roughly surrounding the pit in a hexagon. However, on each side of the wall, 30 to 40 centimeters over the ground, they had left open a long and narrow cross, which slightly resembled a window but appeared to be a bit smaller. "It won't be a house." "Calling it a house wouldn't be wrong. I just went and asked a mason." Job nodded. "He told me that this was something His Royal Highness, the Prince, had come up with. When the firearm team hides themselves within, they can fire while being half buried in the ground, not having to worry about anything. But they also have a unique name. His Royal Highness called it a bunker." Chapter 198: The Sudden Opening. 3 days passed quickly, and the construction of the defense line had finally ended. Roland stood on a stage far behind the front line, the same way he had done when they repelled the demonic beast during the months of demons. Today, he once again went to the battlefield in person in order to inspire all of the officers and soldiers of the First Army. Due to having a special task, Nightingale had already snuck onto the battlefield, and took Echo along with her. Because of this, it was Anna who stood at his side this time and took over Nightingale's protection duty. Roland himself wore a coated armor together with 2 revolvers fastened at his waist. However, as long as the defensive line didn't totally fall apart, allowing a rushing enemy to pass through like a fish that was escaping the net, it would be awfully difficult for the enemy to pose a threat to him. Currently the enemy is about 10 kilometers away from here. "Goo," a giant pigeon informed him as it descended from the sky and landed on his shoulder. "Well done, keep watching." Roland took a piece of beef jerky from his pocket and passed it to Maggie's mouth. Within 2 or 3 pecks she had swallowed down the whole jerky, then once more opened her wings and rose into the sky, flying eastwards. With Lightning and Maggie taking turns investigating, Roland had a clear picture of the enemy's movements this whole time, allowing him to set the battlefield comfortably to his liking. When dealing with crazy drugged warriors, confronting them in a line formation wasn't safe. He was especially taking extra care after Lightning's report that several hundreds of them were wearing short spears. If he wasn't wrong, then it was likely that the spears would be used as preemptive weapons. The range of throwing weapons shouldn't be longer than 50 meters, however, this was only the case for ordinary people. But, how far they could throw them after taking the pills, Roland wasn't sure of either. If they could reach further than 100 meters, they would become a threat to the firearm team. Because of that, he had chosen to put down a number of bunkers, and implementing urban tactics. By constructing a barricade, letting the guns stopping them from coming closer, and an artillery barrage as support, he had built an insurmountable line of defense. Under the current situation of having a sufficient amount of cement, it was easier to quickly construct some bunkers than construct the city wall. Furthermore, the bunkers were only a building with a monolayer of bricks, making it somewhat fragile, but for the militia who weren't using heavy siege equipment, that should still be an unbreakable fortification. 10 bunkers forming a rhombus were built on each side of the road, forming a crossfire zone. Each bunker was stationed with 24 soldiers, half of whom were veterans with the other half being recruits. The experienced veterans were responsible for shooting, while the recruits were responsible for loading ammunition. Lastly, Soraya had also drawn an optical camouflage for the bunker, so that as long as someone was looking from a distance, the bunker would become interspersed into the surrounding environment, making it difficult to distinguish the difference between the two. Behind the front line there stood the artillery unit. The 20 cannons were lined up and would follow the same firing sequence as last time, adjusting the firing angle and filling the corresponding ammunition according to lightning signals. At the side of artillery positions there also stood an emergency force, with about 100 people, equipped with flintlock guns, whose only task was to protect the artillery unit and the prince, His Royal Highness, who was standing behind them. Watching the line of defense and seeing the soldiers with their high morale and their spirits trembling with excitement, within his heart, Roland was deeply moved. The army, at first extremely weak and fragile, built out of people who only enrolled into the military with the purpose of having an egg to eat, after going through the baptism of the months of demons and the defense battle, now stood side by side, proudly wearing on their shoulders the responsibility of defending their home. "Your Highness, right now the enemy is only 2 kilometers away from us," Lightning reported as she returned. "Very well, the surveillance task will be fully handed over to Maggie. You instead will have to go into the woods and issue the signals for the artillery." Roland nodded, then turned to the chief knight and said, "Pass my order. All members of the First Army should enter their alert position and prepare to welcome the enemy." "Yes." Carter saluted. Asterisk. Lehman felt it as his hand became harder and harder to move. 2 days ago he had constantly felt a burning pain, but by now he had almost lost all feelings in his arm. He could no longer put his armor over his swollen greenish-blue arm. At the place where the iron hammer had hit his arm, it had left behind a blackish red mark. At first glance it looked like a somewhat transparent yet shiny layer was laid over his skin. "The bone must be broken," he thought. "If I don't treat it soon, this arm won't be preserved." The analgesic drugs we found in the church can alleviate the pain, but they cannot regenerate a broken bone. He decided to wait until the end of the battle before he would immediately return to King's City, where he would go find the best pharmacists and alchemists in the whole kingdom of Grey Castle. "They ought to be able to cure this damned internal injury I have." "Sir Lehman, your hand, is it really all right?" Levin asked, concerned. "It just looks a bit scary," he pretended to be indifferent. "Let's put it off until after we've attacked Border Town. For now, the town still isn't in our hands, so we should keep our concentration focused on that task." "I hope the pain in your arm didn't make you head muzzy, sir," Dwayne sneered. "How do you want to attack the town?" The tone the other night spoke with made Lehman frown, but now wasn't the time to care about such a small matter. According to the news we were able to gather from the nobles of the Wolf and Elk family, they mainly relied on a long-range offensive weapon to curb the knights. This kind of weapon could attack the knights before their charge reached them. Furthermore, when used they are accompanied by a flame and a loud noise. All in all they are similar to a huge ballista, which can throw objects at a much faster speed than a crossbow arrow. In other words, despite its power, it cannot continuously fire, right? Levin quickly seized the key point. "Yes, the faster we are able to reach their defense, the fewer attacks we will have to face," Lehman nodded. "In addition, the number of people is also crucial. As far as I know, Duke Ryan and his coalition of nobles altogether only had 200 knights, and in the end, they only missed the chance to break through by a final step. However, we possess more than 1,500 people, who, after taking the pills, aren't any slower than a running horse, so our result will be entirely differently than the last attempt. Or all that will never happen." Dwayne thought otherwise. Perhaps Roland Wimbledon is still sitting in his castle, waiting for the arrival of the envoy. So, as long as we relaxedly enter the castle, we can just go and chop off his head. "No, by now he definitely has noticed us." Lehman categorically denied this option. "Didn't you discover that within the last 3 days we hadn't come across any caravan? That the merchants in Longsong Stronghold, after seeing our large unit, chose to either stay or return to the stronghold isn't strange. but that we hadn't seen any caravan coming from border town is unusual. The only explanation for this is that the prince must have sealed border town off. Do you finally understand why His Majesty chose Sir Lehman to be captain instead of you? Levin asked mockingly. Well, it looks like you have no problem with your head, Dwayne just shrugged his shoulders. This way it's quite good. Compared with merely killing the prince by myself, it will be more interesting to kill all of those outcasts who dare to rebel against His Majesty Timothy. Sir Lehman, we have discovered soldiers and horses in front of border town, the investigating cavalier reported. All right, let's go and have a look. Lehman pushed his horse forward. At this point the castle's outline had become faintly visible, and at the end of the road he could see some shadows busy walking. Pulling out his observation mirror, he carefully observed the arrangement of the enemy's defensive line. Those things with the wheels, according to our intelligence they should be the long-range attack weapons, but their number seemed to be much greater than was reported. Should we have everyone rush madly at them? Levin asked. This road is a bit narrow, I am afraid that it can't accommodate the whole militia. He looked at the woods to the right of him. We should branch off some people and let them circle around, even though they will be slower, but that won't matter. As long as we are able to start a flank attack, their defensive line won't be able to last for long. The moment Lehman was preparing to give his commands to adjust his army, he suddenly caught a touch of white from the corner of his eyes. Being startled, he stared blankly. Is this a hallucination caused by my broken arm? Impossible, it actually is a woman. The woman was wearing a hood, her whole body was covered with a white robe, and even faster than he was able to open his mouth to shout, a flame suddenly appeared from her hands. Lehman only felt how his head suddenly got hit by a force similar to the hammer, before the world began to spin and he fell into darkness. Chapter 199 Chaos of War. Everyone charge! Almost at the same time, Lehman's voice sounded out loudly. Levin stared disbelievingly at Lehman Hawes, who had suddenly fallen from his horse. The back of his head was completely blown away, revealing a red and white sticky paste from within. His helmet laid broken to the side, blooming with a big hole at its top, showing that it had not had any protective effect. Charge, everyone, to me. Then Levin's voice also rang out. No, they both hadn't spoken. Levin covered his mouth. Looking behind him, he saw the militia wasn't waiting. They immediately swallowed the pills and began to rush, just like a flood of people coming towards him. It's a witch. He realized that a witch had imitated his voice. Do not charge, cease. He shouted out as loudly as he could. However, within the excited crowd his voice didn't spread very far. The few people who had heard his cry stopped, but even more continued charging forward. Hurry, quickly attack, try to break through the center of the enemy's defense line. Everyone who reaches the town is allowed to plunder. It wasn't just his voice, Dwayne's, and the voices of the other knights also sounded out, one after another, as if all of this was by prior arrangement. Moreover, the witch's voice overshadowed all the other noises, as if it was being directly created next to his ear. Within the militia, there were also many voices bursting out, as if in line with their commands. The crowd began to shout out looting slogans. Levin didn't know who had started it, but soon the slogans rang throughout all of the ranks. The situation had completely gone beyond his control. Levin didn't try to shout any more commands, they would just be drowned in the excited roars of the crowd anyway. Instead, he had to fully concentrate on controlling his horse, in order to avoid getting himself pulled away by the mighty current. And as if they have lost all reason, the militia rushed towards the center of the road. No, that wasn't right. From the very beginning they had already lost all reason, especially in the case of someone else guiding them. After they took the drugs they became totally euphoric, and with the thought of killing and looting they got even further stimulated. In the beginning, the first people had still tried to avoid stepping on the fallen Lehman, but the people after didn't care any longer, and directly stepped onto the corpse. Levin wanted to meet up with Dwayne and the other knights, only to discover that they had been scattered all over the place by the flood of people. Under these compelling circumstances, he would first have to go along with the stream of people, and gradually try to lead his horse to the woods at the side. In case he decided to turn his horse directly, It was only a matter of time before he would be knocked down by the strength and forced militia, and if he then wanted to get up again, it would be nearly impossible. From within the ranks, Levin was looking all over the place, trying to find the witch responsible for causing the chaos, wanting to chop her in 1,000 pieces. In his view, this definitely had to be the doing of a witch. The 1,500 people who had eaten the pill are rushing into the direction of the prince's defense line. For the prince, this wave has to be a deadly attack. Even if the other side had now more of the new weapons, it still won't be enough to go against so many people at once. For that guy, the result of this won't be much better. A situation where both sides have to suffer a loss is obviously something the witches will be jubilant about. This was also the reason why they had infiltrated our ranks and caused so much trouble, luring our army to advance forward of their own initiative. The witch who killed Lehman and the witch who created the chaos can't be the same person. Levin let his gaze wander over the few people who still stood at his side. They had previously stood at the front and had witnessed the fall of Lehman. Furthermore, later they had also heard him calling for a stop. But they couldn't be compared with the huge army of before. Even if they gathered, they still couldn't reach 30 people. One of the witches has the ability to hide her body and the other one can manipulate her voice. After all, a witch cannot have two abilities. Go and find the latter. I want to tear out her throat. Through the shooting window, Brian could see how the enemy steadily came closer. From the bunkers at the forefront, even the first gunfire could be heard. His defensive position was at the middle of the diamond. Because of this, he had to wait until the enemy passed the purple marks at the side of the road. Having to wait so long before he can fire made him very anxious. To do something else, he went to the window on the other side. There Brian could look at the defense line further behind. From the artillery positions, white smoke was unceasingly rising up, and with it, a thunder-like roar rolled over the battlefield. They are once again the first to become busy. With their 12-pounder they can almost cover the entire battlefield. As long as he listened carefully, he could even hear the screams of the shells as they flew through the air. Oh my God, they are running so fast. Look at that fellow, his hand was torn off by a shell, yet he is still running forward. What His Highness said was true. Can they still be called human? They are simply the same as demonic beasts. Because the First Army was already informed during the pre-battle mobilization of the enemy having taken the church's berserker pills, they didn't become scared when they saw the enemy's continued attack even under a hail of bullets. Instead, they were full of fighting spirit. After all, they were the First Army, who got forged under the flames of demonic beasts. Captain, they are coming. Someone warned. Hearing the call, Brian quickly returned to his position, took a revolver rifle next to the window and began loading it. Compared to the old weapons, His Highness' new version had a simple improvement. Now, within a breath he could already fire off 5 rounds of bullets, then he could just throw the cartridge towards the recruit standing behind him, take the 5 extra rounds and fire them off, while the recruit would have reloaded his previous cartridge. However, during the training, His Highness had stressed that only when the enemy had stepped into the range of 100 to 50 meters, were they allowed to use this kind of shooting. While for long-range shooting they had to aim to be as accurate as possible, because the manufacturing the bullets of revolver rifles was very troublesome, everyone's amount of rounds were limited. Brian deeply believed that the shells which contained the gunpowder, with their slender front and thick back, and their almost always similar form, absolutely couldn't have been created by a blacksmith. He knew that such a fine and delicate work had to have come from the hands of a witch. Usually, after the shooting exercise, they would collect all their cartridge cases and hand them over to Iron X. Shooting practice was generally followed with a reloading exercise, during which they would sit as a group in the center of the camp. To assemble the used cartridges into a new bullet, they had to follow strict operating guidelines. First, they had to push the primer to the bottom, followed by filling it up with gunpowder, then finally inserting the projectile. Due to the exercises, he was reluctant to consume his ammunition carelessly, in case the target was too hard to hit. The moment the enemy crossed the purple marker, Brian took a deep breath, then finally shouted, "Fire at will." The soldier that had been waiting for this order for a very long time, enthusiastically aimed at an easy target and started pulling the trigger. Suddenly, the bunker became flooded with the sound of the gunfire. The first enemy to cross the line was hit by bullets from both sides, which caused blood to splash from his waist. After staggering 2 steps forward, he fell to the ground. It was obviously that they could suffer through more pain than ordinary people, but in the face of heavy-caliber bullets, this still didn't matter. Brian noticed that several people had jumped on the top of the frontmost bunkers, wanting to sneak attack the soldiers who were inside from the back, but they were blocked out by a thick iron gate. Not hesitating, he pulled the trigger, killing off the madmen who were exposing their bodies to him one after the other. The reason why the bunkers were arranged in a diamond formation was so that they could help with defending one another. Enemies who wanted to bypass the first row and attack from behind would be shot to death by the rearmost bunkers. "Be careful, they've thrown out their spears," someone suddenly shouted. Brian noticed how a dense shadow rose up from the center of the enemy's army. After passing its apex, they began to fall upon the bunkers that were on both sides of the road. At such a distance, they have to cover 200 or 300 meters. He subconsciously lowered his head into the pit, only to hear the sound of a series of cracking sounds from the top. After this wave of attacks had come to its end, he stood up straight and discovered that not one of those spears had been able to penetrate the bunker. Looking at the bunker in front, he saw that their situation was similar. Only a few spears had been able to insert themselves into the wall, like some lonely feathers. "Even if it looks very scary, it is still useless," everyone began to roaring with laughter. At this moment, Brian saw one enemy who disregarded all dangers, and threw up several splashes of earth in his forward charge towards their bunker. Then the enemy bent over and threw his spear in a flat curve, and at the very moment the spear left his arm, he was nailed down by an intense hail of bullets. Down. Even before his warning shout could entirely leave his throat, the thrown spear already passed through the shooting window, and pierced the chest of a shooter. The latter issued a stuffy groan and then fell face up, towards the ground. Chapter 200 Hunters and Prey. "Freckle!" someone shouted, "he's injured. Do not move him." Brian roared, "I'll go and take a look at his injury, you continue shooting." He put his rifle in the hands of the recruit at his side, the one who was responsible for loading, and lowered his waist to approach the injured soldier. The wounded, who still hadn't lost his consciousness, asked in a trembling voice, "Captain, am I going to die?" The short spear had pierced him at the lower pit of the stomach. It was unclear if it had gone through, however, seeing that his breath still seemed to be flowing freely, the spear must not have punctured his lung. During culture class, His Royal Highness had briefly described the various organs of the human body and which measures were to be taken in the case of an injury. The best solution Brian could think of at the moment was to remain here and wait until the end of the fight, then allow for Miss Nana to come over and treat him. "Does it hurt?" Brian asked. Freckles nodded with difficulty. "Since you can still feel pain, it means you won't die." To reassure the knight, he put his hand on Freckles' forehead. "You should know about Miss Nana's ability, right?" With difficulty, Freckles was able to show a smile. "During times of peace, everyone wants to go see her. Putting it that way, I can finally see her, now." "That's right. Therefore you have to persevere." When Brian returned to his shooting window, the recruit turned towards him and asked concerned, "Why didn't you pull the spear out?" "By pulling it out it is likely that instead of helping, it could cause massive bleeding. Later in class you will also learn about this, and then everything will become clear." He paused. "The best we can now do for him is to defeat the enemy as quickly as possible." Standing on his heightened stage, Roland could clearly see the enemy rushing like a tide towards the town. The moment they crossed the first row of bunkers, their speed slowed down a lot. By the time they reached the third row of bunkers, the enemy's flanks were fully exposed to riflemen's crossfire. Echo's task was quite obvious. Even though the enemy's force was stretched into a long line, most of them still acted in accordance with her unceasingly issued concentrated charge command, rushing along the road. Every moment there were a lot of their people falling, and they couldn't do anything about it. Having to face up against a fortification they couldn't destroy with their spears and swords, Timothy's militia force could do nothing except endure the casualties they faced and continue pushing forward. After they passed the third row of bunkers, they crossed the 300 meters mark, which meant that now the cannons would now be loaded with canister shells. Among the gunners, stepping into this area was also known as entering into the death zone. In the sky, lightning had replaced her flag with one in bright red. The angle of the 20 cannons were lying flat, their front spit out flames and thick smoke. Roland had roughly estimated that the most skilled artillery group would be able to release one shrapnel shot every 20 seconds, while the slowest would need it around 30 seconds. At first glance, it seemed that they came close to the rate of fire of the best artillery groups during the American Civil War, but the latter's 3 shots per minute were performed with solid shells, for which they had to clean the cannon repeatedly and aim it at the target once more. However, canister shells could be fired without aiming, and the cannon also didn't need to be wiped, so it was only natural that the rate of fire would be fast. For the enemy, such a rate of fire was terrible news. Furthermore, the canister shell's kill and injure rate without even aiming was especially astonishing. Almost every iron bullet would penetrate 2 to 3 people. Although after taking the pill they could withstand a great deal of pain, the pills couldn't also suppress fear. When seeing how the people around them were slaughtered one after another, even if they were totally excited and thirsted after massacre, they were unable to suppress their bodies' instinctual fear of death. Even more, they originally hadn't been an iron-willed force. Without their pills, these people were just a group of untrained civilians lacking in true practical combat experience. When half of their force laid out on the road, the enemy began to flee. Like a plague, the fear quickly spread. What began with one person was soon followed by a second and a third, until the forefront eventually completely stopped with its assault, and instead wholly started to turn around and flee. Once again the artillery regiment changed their ammunition to solid bullets, aiming at the center of the road, while the whole time the bunkers had never ceased in their shooting, creating a pile of corpses laid on top of the road. As Levin's raging heart gradually cooled down, a feeling of fear began to grow within him. In the beginning, more than 20 people had set out and discovered the witch wearing strange clothes, who created the chaos, hiding within the forest, almost perfectly integrating with the surrounding scenery. If she hadn't moved forward along with the main force, always guiding the people to cram themselves together at the middle of the road, it would have been almost impossible for them to detect her. Even after they had discovered her, she still caused considerable trouble to Levin. He found out that she didn't need her mouth to imitate the voices, and even more the sound drifted around without an anchored source. Sometimes, it was coming from the left, other times it would come from the right, and at times even came from behind him. The content was also varied, such as imitating his accent and giving orders or sending out a distressed call for help from a fellow militiaman. But when they wanted to close in and seize her, the woman dressed in white appeared again. Seeing her, Levin recalled the shocking scene of her killing Lehman Hawes. In her hand she was grasping a silver-white light crossbow, and the moment she sent out a spark, with a loud bang, another person would fall. The surrounding encirclement was instantaneously torn into shreds, all of them suddenly turning into frightened birds. My armor doesn't offer any protection, and using a shield also doesn't work. The iron shield tied to Levin's arm had been broken in half. Seeing the hole in the metal told him how powerful that weapon really was. I'm afraid the only weapon that can match up with this power is a heavy crossbow. If he hadn't subconsciously lowered his head, he would have already become a corpse by now. But a heavy crossbow can't be fired off in succession. With her hiding ability and her unrivaled weapon, Levin realized that they stood no chance of winning. The moment he became aware of this, it felt as if he had met with a cold wind. His burning rage was quickly extinguished. Take the pills and kill her the moment she appears. Even though his mouth called to attack, Levin himself retreated, planning on running into the woods the moment she put her focus on the militia. No, it should be even safer to stay within the large group. She will never dare attack me when I'm inside the crowd. Furthermore, this forest seemed to have grown very strange, the thick weeds almost reaching to my knees, covering the vines below, as if they want to trip me. When he finally was able to stumble out of the woods, Levin looked toward the front, wanting to hide within the large group, yet the scene in front of him left him stunned. The drug efficacy shouldn't have come to its end, so why are they retreating? No, that's not right. It should be said that they are running away. Those who move too slow or haven't responded have been mercilessly pushed to the ground and later trampled on. During the charge they ran as fast as horses, but now with the escape it was the same. During their raging flight they were throwing dust into the sky. Seeing such a situation, he did not dare to come close to in the attempt to stop them. In the end, what happened? Levin was unable to process the situation. In such a short time, how was it possible to entirely defeat the 1,500 people? Even more, since all of them had taken those pills. Are the prince's men actually monsters? At this moment, from behind him, the sound of someone stepping on weeds could be heard. Gritting his teeth, Levin suddenly drew his sword and stabbed with it behind himself. At this critical moment of life and death, his quick drawing technique was faster than ever before, like a flash of lightning. Nevertheless, he was still greeted by a dazzling flame. His blade was hit by something, sending sparks flying, and stabbing into his hand, instantly erasing the feelings from his fingertips. When he moved his line of sight towards his arm, Levin saw that half of his arm was missing, exposing red and white muscles and bones, like a flower in full bloom. The woman in white looked at him with a blank expression. Unable to confront her, he couldn't help but back up several steps, tripping over a weed. The moment he laid still, the witch placed her foot on his shoulder and pressed her cold weapon against his forehead. From his perspective on the ground, Levin could see the face hidden under the hood. So beautiful, was his final thought as the gunshot rang out.